Hello friend, and welcome back. I'm glad you found your way here again tonight. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head. Your hands can go loose wherever they have landed, and your eyes can close whenever they would like to, now or in a little while. It makes no difference at all. Washington in the 1890s. The White House, before anybody rebuilt it. 2 women cooked for the President of the United States, in 2 kitchens under the state floor, and when the last of the daylight went out of that building, somebody had to walk it, room by room, and put the lights out by hand. Not the President. He would not touch the switches. So who was awake in that house while America slept? If quiet history like this is good to fall asleep to, a subscribe and a like help these long nights find the people who want them, though there is no need to do any of that now. And if you feel like it, say in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Somebody is reading that in a cold room with the lamp turned low. Somebody else has a long dark road still to drive, so dim whatever you still have burning. Let the fan hum, and come back with me now all the way back to a damp and crowded and very much loved house in Washington in the last years before anyone thought to rebuild it. It is late afternoon in Washington and the light is going. The house sits behind its fence on a low green lawn, white and square and smaller than you are picturing it. That is the first thing to let go of tonight. Whatever image you carry of this building, scale it down. In the 1890s, the White House was a large house, and that is all. It was not the marble idea it has since become. It was a family home with a government inside it, and by the standards of the enormous new fortunes going up on Fifth Avenue and out at Newport, it was a modest one. And all day long people had simply walked in. That is the strangest thing about this building in this decade, and it is worth standing still with for a moment before the doors close. There was no appointment system as we would understand it. There was no cordon. There was a fence and a drive and a door at the north front, and behind that door there were men whose entire working life was the management of whoever came up it. They came all day, office seekers mostly, men with letters of introduction and a hope of a position somewhere in the government. Tourists came, in from the trains, wanting to see the East Room. Petitioners came, cranks came, widows came with claims, congressmen came sideways, wanting a word, and plain curious citizens came, because it was their house, or so every one of them believed. And belief like that is very hard to argue with at a doorway. The men who met them were the doorkeepers. There were 4 of them, in the summer of 1893, working under one chief. 4. Hold that number for a moment, because it is going to sit under this whole first hour. 4 men and their chief, standing between the President of the United States and anybody in America who felt like coming to see him. I am not going to give you the chief doorkeeper's name tonight, and I want to tell you why, because it is the kind of small honesty this channel likes. The records disagree. One account gives one name for the man Benjamin Harrison appointed in 1889. Another gives a different name entirely for the man holding the post 4 years later. They may be 2 men. They may be 1 man and a clerk's slip. Nobody has reconciled it, so I will not pretend to, and he stays as the record leaves him. The chief doorkeeper, it is not much of a memorial, it is what he has. What we do know is the shape of his day, and the shape of his day is the reason we are here at the north door as the light fails. Because the day has to end. That is the thing. A house that anyone can walk into has to have a moment when the walking in stops, and that moment has to be made. By hand, by a person, every single evening, so watch him do it. The last caller of the day is almost always a hopeful one. The confident visitors come in the morning. The ones who come at the end of the afternoon have usually spent the day working up to it, walking the block a few times, and they arrive with the light already yellowing on the portico. He knows the type. He has met the type for years. There is a courtesy in how this is done that I find genuinely moving. This is the point in the story where you might expect a door slammed, a hand up, an official brusqueness. It was not like that by every account we have of these men. The house had a tone, and the tone was southern and slow and personal. A doorkeeper who was rude was no use to anybody, because the person he was rude to would write to a newspaper, and the newspaper would print it, and the president would hear about it before the week was out. So it is done gently. The president is not receiving. The hour is past. Come back tomorrow and come early. Yes, the East Room can be seen tomorrow. No, there is no need for a letter. And there is a particular skill in that, which nobody ever put on a payroll. The doorkeeper has to disappoint somebody without humiliating them. That is the whole job, said properly. A man has come a long way. He has a letter in his pocket from somebody at home who assured him it would be enough. He has been rehearsing a sentence, and the answer is no, tonight, and the answer will very likely be no tomorrow as well. The doorkeeper knows all of that as the man comes up the steps. He can read it in the walk, so he does the small things. He uses the hour rather than the person as the reason. He offers the East Room because the East Room is free and it is worth seeing, and it sends a man home with something. He does not stand in the doorway blocking it. He steps out onto the portico, which turns a refusal into a conversation. None of that is written down anywhere. It is simply what 4 men and their chief did, all day, for years, and then the door. It is heavy and it is old, and it has been swinging since before anyone now in the house was born. It goes shut, the bolt goes across, and the whole building changes. I want you to feel that change, because it is the hinge the entire night turns on. All day this house has been facing outward. It has been a public office, a monument, a place of business, a stop on a tour. Every room on the state floor has been available to strangers. And now the door is bolted and the house turns around and it faces inward, and it becomes what it also is, which is somebody's home. The hall goes quiet in stages. First the voices stop, then the footsteps, then, a little later, the sound of the last carriage on the drive going away. Outside, the fence lamps will be lit before long. Washington in this decade is a low city, brick and gaslight, and the mansion stands in its own grounds with the city walking past it. The traffic on the avenue thins through the evening the way it always does. Horses mostly. The occasional bell from a firehouse somewhere across the city, carrying further than it would in daylight. Inside, the house begins its other life. There are people in this building right now whose day is only just reaching its useful part. Down below the floor you're standing on, in rooms you have not seen yet, ranges are being fed and pans are going on, and a dinner is being assembled for 7 o'clock. Somewhere at the back a man is thinking about the furnace and whether it will hold through the night. Out past the west terrace, under a great deal of glass, another man is thinking about the temperature in a room full of camellias. None of those people are going to be turned away at the door, because none of them ever come to it. They are already inside. Most of them have been inside for years. That is the household. That is who we are here for. And when the day's last light goes off the top of the north portico, and the hall stands empty with the bolt across the door, somewhere in the house, another light goes out. Come with me upstairs, because directly above our heads there is a floor unlike any floor in any house this channel has ever taken you into, and I want you to see it before the clerks go home. The stair comes up into a corridor, and the corridor is the strangest room in America. Let me put it to you plainly, and then we can walk it slowly. In the 1890s, the president's family lived on the 2nd floor of the White House. Bedrooms, sitting rooms, the private life of a household with children and grandchildren and in-laws in it. And the president's entire office, his clerks, his callers, his cabinet room, was also on the 2nd floor of the White House, at the east end of the same corridor. 1 floor, 1 hallway, a government at one end and a family's bedroom doors at the other. There was no West Wing. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to hear that and picture the building we know with a piece missing. It is not that. Where the West Wing stands today, there was something else entirely in this decade, an enormous complex of glass, which we are going out to later tonight, and which is one of the loveliest things in this whole story. The offices had nowhere to go, so the offices lived upstairs, in the house, past the bedrooms, which meant that all day, every day, men came up that stair, clerks with papers, messengers, senators, job seekers who had got past the doorkeepers with a letter. They walked along a corridor with the family's rooms opening off it, and they turned right at the end and went into the offices, and they walked back out the same way. If a first lady wanted to cross from her room to the stair, she crossed a public hallway to do it. If a grandchild ran the length of it, the grandchild ran through a government. Nobody thought this was ideal. Everybody said so. Carolyn Harrison in particular found the house inadequate as a residence and said it out loud, and we will come back to what she did about it, because she did rather a lot. But tonight we are here for the moment it ends, because it does end every evening. That is the second hinge of the night, and it comes soon after the first. The bolt goes across the north door downstairs, and then, a little later, up here, the offices go quiet. The clerks put their papers away. The messengers stop coming up. Somewhere a drawer is locked, because a house that anybody can walk into needs its papers locked. The lamps at the east end go out, one and then another, and the corridor between the two halves of this floor stops being a thoroughfare. And the house becomes a home again for about 10 hours. I love this transition, and I do not think any other building in this channel's world can offer it. In a great house at Newport, the day and the evening are the same kind of thing done at different volumes. Here, the day and the evening are two different uses of one hallway, and the changeover happens quietly every night, in the dark, with nobody watching, and then reverses at 8 the next morning. There is one man I want to put in this corridor with you, because he was in it longer than almost anybody. His name was Colonel William Crook. He came to the White House in January of 1865 as one of Abraham Lincoln's bodyguards. He was off duty on the night of the assassination. And then, in the way that happens to certain people in certain buildings, he simply never left. He stayed for more than 50 years, across 12 presidencies. He was made executive clerk to the president in December of 1870, and in March of 1877, Ulysses Grant made him disbursing agent for the salary and contingent funds of the executive mansion. Sit with that title for a second, because it is drier than it sounds and much warmer than it looks. Disbursing agent means he paid the wages. So in the 1890s, in this corridor, in the evening, when the offices have gone quiet and the clerks have gone home, there is a man walking to the stair who physically handed money to the people who kept this house, and who had been standing in this building when Lincoln was in it. He had seen the corridor with a war in it. He had seen it with a funeral in it. He had watched families move in and families move out for nearly 25 years before this decade even began. He wrote 2 books about it later, through 5 administrations and memories of the White House, which is how we know as much as we do. For our purposes, he is something better than a source. He is the building's memory. When we walk this corridor tonight, we are walking it with a man who could stand in it in 1893 and see it in 1865 at the same time. That is the quality I want you to carry with you into the rest of the night. Continuity. The sense of a building that has been being looked after continuously by overlapping lifetimes for a very long time. Presidents arrive here and leave here on a 4-year clock. The people in this corridor are on a completely different clock. 50 years in Crook's case. We're going to meet a man later tonight who gave it 35, and another who gave it 42, and a gardener who held 8 glass houses alive for 25 winters. They are the actual permanent residents of this address, and almost nobody knows their names. And there is a practical side to that continuity which I think gets missed. Every 4 years, this building had to teach a new family how to live in it. Where things were, which door was which, what time the house ate, and what happened if you changed it, how the bells worked, which of the rooms downstairs was too damp to keep anything in. None of that is written in a manual. It is carried in people. So when a new president arrived at this address, the house that received him was not a set of rooms. It was a group of people who already knew everything, waiting quite patiently to be asked. Somebody had to show a first lady where the linen was kept. Somebody had to explain to a brand new private secretary that the corridor he was walking down had bedrooms on it. Crook did that over and over across 12 presidencies for more than 50 years. The corridor is dark at the east end now. At the west end, the family's rooms are lit, and there is a low sound coming from behind a door, a voice and then another voice, the ordinary noise of a household at the end of a day. You cannot make out the words, and you are not meant to. It is one of the warmest sounds there is, the murmur of people talking in a room you're not in. Below us, the state floor is empty and cooling and waiting. One more light goes out along the corridor as the last clerk goes down. Let us go down too, because the rooms below us are the ones the whole country pictures when it pictures this house, and at this hour they are completely empty, and there is a wall of coloured glass down there that no living person has ever seen. Come down the stair slowly. There is no hurry in this house tonight, and there will not be any for the next 3 hours. The state floor is the public house. This is the part of the building the whole country believed it part-owned, and in a real sense the whole country did. This is where the tours came, this is where the receptions were held, and at this hour, with the north door bolted and the last of the daylight going blue in the tall windows, it is entirely empty. Empty rooms are one of the best things this channel gets to give you, and this floor is a very good one. Start in the cross hall, the long corridor that runs the width of the house. And look west, because across the western end of it there is something extraordinary that is not there anymore. A screen of glass, floor to ceiling, in opalescent colour. It was made for Chester Arthur and set in place in 1882, and it closed off the entrance hall from the corridor beyond. Opalescent glass does something particular with light. It does not simply let light through the way a window does, it holds the light inside itself, and glows, and gives back a softer and stranger version of whatever is behind it. In the daytime, with the north light coming through the entrance, it threw colour down the marble of the hall. In the evening, with lamps behind it, it did the reverse. It stood there for 20 years. Then, in the rebuilding at the start of the next century, it was taken out and broken up, and it is gone. Completely. I find that quietly astonishing. One of the most beautiful objects in the most famous house in America, and nobody alive has ever seen its colour. We are not going to be sad about that tonight. This channel does not do that. We are going to do the other thing, which is to stand in front of it while it is still here, in 1893 in the dark, and look at it properly. Behind the screen the rooms run west in their file. The east room first, at the other end the great space of the house, long and high and hung with chandeliers. Then, past the hall, the 3 drawing rooms in their order, the green room, the blue room, the red room, each named for the colour that covered it, and then the state dining room at the western end. All of it, and I mean all of it, is deeply and heavily Victorian. Modern eyes have to adjust. We picture these rooms as they are now, which is to say restrained, pale, symmetrical, museum quiet. In the 1890s they were the opposite of restrained. Carpet ran wall to wall. Curtains hung in weight, layered, fringed, pulled back with cord. The furniture was upholstered, and there was a great deal of it, arranged in clusters rather than lines. Every flat surface had something on it, and there were plants everywhere. That is the detail I want to plant with you now because it pays off later tonight. The palms came in from outside. There was a whole world of glass out past the west terrace growing them, and for every reception and every dinner the gardeners brought them in, arranged them, and took them back out again afterward. The greenery in these photographs is not decoration bought once. It is a living inventory, carried in and carried out all night if necessary by men we are going to meet. There is a figure moving through these rooms in the early evening, and everybody who ever visited this house knew him on sight. He is a black man of about 50, in a white linen suit and a Turkish cap, and he is carrying a feather duster. His name is Jeremiah Smith. Everybody calls him Jerry. He's going to have a chapter of his own later tonight, and he has earned it, so I am only going to introduce him here. He came to this house under Ulysses Grant in the late 1860s as a footman. By the 1890s he has been here more than 20 years, and he is nowhere near finished. The government paperwork lists him as a labourer. What he actually was on any given day was a valet, a footman, a butler, a cook, a doorman, a custodian, and, most famously and most publicly, the duster of the White House. And here he is in the Red Room in The Last of the Light, doing the thing he is known for. There is a rhythm to dusting a room like this that anybody who has ever cleaned a crowded space will recognize. You do not do it in a line, you do it in a loop, and you do the same loop every evening, and after 20 years your hands know the loop better than your head does. The feather duster goes over the mantel, along the frames, across the top of the cabinet, around the lamp, and you never have to think about the order once, and it genuinely had to be done every evening, which is the part that surprises people. Think about what was falling on these rooms all day. Coal smoke from the grates, soot from the gas, the dust that 1,000 feet a week bring in off a Washington Street, in a city that was still half unpaved in places, ash, pollen in the season, and the ordinary shedding of a room full of wool and velvet and horsehair. A room like the Red Room, left alone for a week, would show it. Left alone for a month, it would be visibly grey along every upper edge. So the loop happens daily, forever, and its entire purpose is that nobody ever notices it has happened. A visitor walks in, and the room looks the way rooms in the White House are supposed to look, and that is the only review the work ever gets. He is not hurrying either. Nobody in this house is hurrying tonight. The tone of the place was slow, by every description we have of it, and the relationships in it were personal rather than formal, and the pace of a house tells you almost everything about what it was like to work in. The lamps are being lit behind him as he goes, and the colour starts to come up in the glass screen, from the other side now, as the hall behind it fills with light and the entrance hall goes dark. Then the dining room is set, and the sound of it carries. Silver on cloth, a chair moved, somebody counting under their breath. We will come back to this floor before the night is out, and to the screen, and to Jerry, and to all of it. But there is something we have to understand first, and it is the light itself, because the light in these rooms in this decade is not one thing. It is two things, overlapping, and one of them had only just arrived. Another light goes out at the far end of the East Room as the shutters are done. Come and see what these rooms were actually lit by, before a young man showed up at the door with a coil of wire. Here is something worth slowing down for, because we say the word lamp and we think we know what it means, and for most of this house's life it meant something we have almost entirely forgotten. It meant fire, indoors, in a glass jar, on a pipe, gaslight. That is what lit this house, and every house of any standing in America, through the middle of the century and deep into this one. Coal gas made in a works somewhere across the city, sent along mains under the streets, up into the building, along pipes inside the walls, and out into the room at a fitting where somebody had to put a flame to it. Let us take that slowly, because the physical reality of it is the reason this whole night exists. First, the sound. Gas hisses, not loudly. It is under the room rather than in it. A faint continuous breath from every burning fixture, and in a room with a chandelier of a dozen burners, it is a soft, steady presence you stop hearing after 10 minutes and notice immediately when it stops. A gaslit house is never quite silent. It has a low voice of its own. Then the smell. Coal gas has an odour, and so does the burning of it. Faintly sweetish, faintly sooty, and it mixes with everything else in a Victorian room. The wool of the carpet, the wax, the coal in the grate, the flowers from the greenhouse. That combination is the smell of the 19th century indoors, and it is completely gone now. Then the light itself, which is the part I most want you to have. Gaslight moves. It is a flame. It flickers, very slightly all the time. It rises when the pressure in the main rises and sinks when it falls, and it responds to a door opening across the room. So a gaslit room is never still. The shadows in the corners breathe. A face across a table is lit unevenly and keeps changing. The colour is yellow, warm, generous to skin and to gilding and to polished wood and unkind to nothing. And it goes upward, hard so the ceiling's paid for it. Over the seasons, the plaster above every fixture in a heavily used room darkened, slowly, in a soft bloom. Anybody who has taken down an old fitting in an old house has seen the ghost of it. In a house like this, with rooms in constant public use, that darkening was a permanent maintenance job. Now, the important part, the part that makes tonight a night. Every one of these had to be lit by hand, not switched, lit. You turned the tap at the fitting to let the gas come, and then you put a flame to it, and it caught. And the flame you carried was usually a taper, a long, thin, waxed wick on a stick, sometimes with a brass holder and a hook on the end for reaching the taps on a high chandelier. So the lighting of a house of this size was not a moment. It was an errand. It was a person walking a route. Let us say his name was Charles, because we do not have his name, and I would rather admit that than invent a source for him. He is a composite, put together from what we know of how houses like this were run, and I will not put a documented word in his mouth. But there was certainly somebody, most evenings, doing exactly this. He starts in the hall, because that is where light is needed first. He works the fixtures in order. Tap, flame, catch, next. He does not look at what he's doing after the first few because his hands know it. He goes down the cross hall, into the red room, where Jerry has just finished, into the blue, into the green, into the state dining room where more light is needed than anywhere, and where the table is already laid. The east room, if it is being used, takes the longest by a distance, because the east room is enormous, and its chandeliers hang high, and every burner on every one of them is a separate small act. There is a whole physical grammar to this that has gone out of the world, and it is worth having. You do not light a gas chandelier from below with your arm up. That is exhausting, and it is unsafe, and it puts your face directly under a fitting that is about to catch. You light it from the side at an angle with the taper reaching in past your own line of sight, and you turn the tap first and give it a beat before you bring the flame. Give it too long and you have a room full of gas. Give it too little and nothing takes, and you have to do it twice. So there is a count. Every person who did this had a count, and it was in their body rather than in their head, and it was different for a low bracket than for a high chandelier because the gas took longer to reach the far burners. And then the sound. A burner catching makes a small soft sound, not quite a pop, and when a chandelier goes up you get a run of them, one after another around the ring as each burner takes in turn. That run of small sounds going around a chandelier in an empty room is one of the things this house did every single evening for the better part of a century, and there is not one recording of it anywhere. And the whole thing runs in reverse at the end of the night, every fixture individually turned off by hand, in the dark mostly, working backward, room by room, with the house going quiet behind you. I want you to have that image, because it is going to matter in about 4 minutes. Putting a house like this to bed was a physical journey through it. It was somebody walking every room in the building last thing, and reaching up, and turning something, and it did not stop being that when the technology changed. That is the thing nobody expects. In 1891, a second kind of light arrived in this house. It came in on wires instead of pipes, and it did not hiss, and it did not move, and it did not blacken the ceiling, and people found the steadiness of it genuinely strange before they found it convenient. For years afterward, the two systems ran side by side in these rooms, gas and electricity together, and a room could be lit by either or both. You would think that would end the evening walk. It did not. For a while, in this particular house, it made the walk more necessary than it had ever been, for a reason so human and so unexpected that I have been waiting 3 chapters to tell you. The taper goes out, the last of the gas fittings in the hall catches and settles, and another light goes out in a room behind us as the shutters are closed on it for the night. Come with me to the door because it is a morning in May in 1891, and a young man has just arrived with a coil of wire over his shoulder, and no idea at all that he has just walked into the rest of his life. His name was Erwin Hood Hoover. Everybody called him Ike. He was born in Washington, the son of a grocer. His first job was as a telephone operator, which in that decade was a young person's trade in a brand new industry, and from there he had gone into the other brand new industry and become an electrician. By 1891 he was working for the Edison Electric Company, and on the 6th of May, 1891, Edison sent him to the White House. The job was to install the first electric lighting in the building, and an electric bell system along with it. It was, from the company's point of view, a straightforward commercial fit out at a prestigious address. Wire the house, test it, hand it over, move on to the next one. He finished on the 15th of May, 9 days. That is the whole job. 9 days to bring electric light into the White House, and I would like you to hold that number, because it is the smallest number in tonight's story and it changed more than any of the others. Now think about what those 9 days actually were. Running wire through a building of this age is not clean work. There are no conduits waiting for you. You are getting into a house whose walls are plaster over brick, whose floors are old, whose rooms are in constant use by a family and a government, and you are threading a modern nervous system through it without taking it apart. You work above ceilings, you lift boards, you find the runs the gas pipes took and you follow them, because somebody has already solved the problem of getting from here to there once, and you do it with people living around you. The family is upstairs, the clerks are along the corridor, there are callers at the door all day, Jerry Smith is dusting past you in his white linen suit, and you are doing it against a deadline that is not really yours. The house has an evening every night. It cannot be shut for a fortnight while a young man from a company gets his wiring right. So the work happens in the gaps, in the mornings, in the rooms that are not wanted that day, and it gets packed up and moved when a room is needed. 9 days of that, and then the lights came on. And then something happened that no electrician in the world could have planned for. The family would not touch it. President Benjamin Harrison and his family considered electricity dangerous. Not inconvenient, not unfamiliar, dangerous. They believed that touching the switches might electrocute them, and so they did not touch the switches. And they were nervous of the new bell system too, which was the same technology in a different costume. So the President of the United States asked the young man from Edison Electric to stay, not for the week, not to finish snagging, to stay on the White House staff as its electrician. And the reason he was needed, the actual daily content of the job, was this. Somebody had to turn the lights on, and somebody had to come back later and turn them off. I want to be careful and fair here, because there is a very famous version of this story that goes one step further and says that because of that fear, the lights were simply left burning all night, every night. I have to tell you honestly that this is the popular telling, and I could not stand it up from a first-hand source, so I am giving it to you exactly as it has come down to us, and no further. It may be true. It is repeated everywhere. I am not going to state it flatly to you at 1 a.m. as though it was settled. What is documented, and what is quite enough, is this. They would not touch the switches, and turning the lights on and off was part of Ike Hoover's job. Sit with the picture for a moment. It is 1892. It is late. The dinner is over. The callers have gone. The corridor upstairs has been dark for an hour. And a man in his 20s, a grocer's son, a former telephone operator, is walking the state floor of the White House alone, room by room, putting the lights out for the most powerful family in America because they will not do it themselves. That is the image this entire night is built on, and I am going to bring you back to it again and again. It is not a story about foolishness. I would like to say that clearly, because it would be easy and cheap to make the Harrisons ridiculous, and they were not ridiculous. They were living in the very first weeks of a technology that we have had for 130 years and they had had for 9 days. Nobody had grown up with it. Nobody had a lifetime of evidence that the switch is safe. Electricity had arrived in their home as an invisible force that came through the walls, and a wire that got hot, and a light that came on with no flame in it, and their instinct was caution. Ours would have been the same. We simply had the good luck to be born after everybody else got used to it. and out of that caution came the job. He stayed 42 years. He began under Benjamin Harrison, and he was still there in the years of Franklin Roosevelt. 10 presidential terms. The young man who came to wire the house for 9 days ended as its chief usher, running the household of the building he had first walked into, carrying wire over his shoulder. He wrote it down at the end, in a book called 42 Years in the White House, and because he wrote it down we have his voice, which is a rare gift in a story like this one. Most of the people we will meet tonight left no words at all. There is one line of his I want to give you now and then let you rest on, because it points at where we're going next. Writing about the house he had spent his life in, and about who really mattered in it, he said this: "The most respected person in the house other than the president's immediate family is the cook. All administration seemed to be in awe of them. He would know, he watched 10 terms of them, so somebody else turned the lights on in the president's house, and somebody else turned them off, every night, for years. Hold on to that. Because the person Ike Hoover thought was the most respected in the building is not upstairs. She is below the floor you're standing on, in a room with 2 ranges and no daylight, and her name was Dolly Johnson, and we are going down the service stair to meet her now." The service stair goes down out of the light, and the temperature changes twice on the way. First it drops because you're going below the level of the ground into old brick, and old brick in Washington holds damp the way a cellar always does. And then, halfway along the corridor at the bottom, it comes back up, hard, because there are ranges burning down here and they have been burning all day. This is the ground floor of the White House, and in the 1890s it is the working floor. I want to describe it honestly because the honest version is warmer than the polished one. It was damp, it was dimly lit, it had pests in it, which we will come to properly in a while, and which produced one of the best lines anyone ever wrote about this house. The rooms were low and the corridor was long, and the light down here came from gas fittings on the wall rather than from windows, because there were not many windows worth the name, and it fed the President of the United States 3 times a day, every day of the year. There were 2 kitchens. 2, that is your number for this chapter, and it will not stop being remarkable however long you look at it. The first sat beneath the state dining room, and it was the one used for large events. That is the room that came alive on a state dinner night, when a full table had to be served upstairs, course after course, hot and in order. The second sat beneath the butler's pantry, and it was the everyday kitchen. Breakfast came out of that room. Lunch came out of that room. The family's ordinary 7 o'clock dinner came out of that room. Most nights of most years. 2 rooms then. One for the country and one for the family. And the whole of the presidential table in both its faces came up out of the floor. That is worth standing still for. Every meal that was ever eaten in the staterooms of this house arrived from underneath. It came up a stair or up a lift in the hands of a butler and footman from a room the guests upstairs had never seen and would never see, and it arrived looking as though it had come from nowhere at all. That is the whole magic trick of a great household, and here it is being performed under the most photographed floor in America. And having 2 kitchens rather than 1 tells you something quite precise about how this house thought. The everyday kitchen is small and close to the family. It is under the butler's pantry, which is to say directly under the route the food takes to the family table. Short distance, few hands, hot food, no ceremony. That is a kitchen designed for a household. The event kitchen is bigger, and it sits under the state dining room, which is the room it exists to serve. Different scale entirely. More surfaces, more fire, room for more people to be working at once without getting in each other's way. So the building was, in its plumbing and its stairs and its layout, permanently prepared to be 2 different things, a home and an institution. Most nights it was only the first. Some nights it had to be both at once, and when it did, the answer was not to work the family's kitchen harder. The answer was to wake the other room. 2 kitchens. It is such a small architectural fact, and it contains the entire double life of this house. Now let us actually be in the room, because I have been talking around it, and it deserves better. The range is the centre of everything. A big cast iron range of this period is a machine you feed rather than a thing you switch on, and it never fully goes out. It is banked down at night and brought up in the morning, and someone has to know it personally. Every range has a character. It runs hot on the left. The oven takes 20 minutes longer than it should on a wet day. The person who cooks on it learns all of that in their hands and never writes any of it down. The heat comes off it in a wall. Step within a yard and you feel it on your face. Step back 3 yards and the cold brick has the room again. In summer, in Washington, in a basement with 2 of these going, the temperature is something you simply have to live inside. Around the range, the working surfaces, scrubbed wood, zinc, iron, copper pans hanging in size order, because copper is heavy and you learn to hang it where your hand already goes. The smells run in layers and they change through the day. In the morning it is bread and coffee and the metallic smell of a fire being brought up. Through the afternoon it is stock, which is the deep bass note of any 19th century kitchen and never entirely goes away. In the evening it is roasting meat and butter and, from the other end of the room, the sweet warm smell of pastry, because there was a second person down here whose whole domain was pastry, and we will meet her shortly. And under all of it, the smell of a damp old basement, which no amount of cooking ever quite covers. The sounds are the best part. A kitchen at full work is one of the most comforting soundscapes there is, and this is why. It is rhythmic. Somebody is chopping. A pan lid is going. There is water running somewhere. The range door opens with a particular clank and closes with another. Feet on stone. 2 or 3 voices, low, in short exchanges that are not conversations because nobody has time for a conversation. Just the shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to need 3 words instead of 10, and every so often the bell, because the bells came down here. Upstairs, a hand pulls a bell rope or, after 1891, presses one of Ike Hoover's electric buttons. Down here a bell answers on a board on the wall and everybody in the room knows which room it came from before they have looked. Now stand at the foot of the stair and look back up it. That stair is the seam of the whole house. On one side of it the President of the United States. On the other side of it a low room full of steam and iron, and 2 women doing extremely skilled work at high speed in bad light. They are the same house. They are the same night. And in a few hours, when the dining room is emptied and the family has gone up, the top half of that stair will be dark and the bottom half will still be working. The woman who ran this room was born into slavery in Kentucky. She had a name that everybody in Washington knew for a season, and then forgot for a century, and it is being remembered again now, which is one of the nicest things I get to tell you tonight. Another light goes out on the floor above her as the staterooms are shuttered. Let me tell you how she got here. Her name was Dolly Johnson. She was born into slavery in Georgetown, Kentucky, around 1852. Her parents were William Johnson and Emily Miller. She was enslaved by a woman named Jane Miller. I have to be careful with that date, and I will be, because the records disagree with each other. A census says one thing. A death record says it does not know. A slave schedule offers a child who might be her and might not. So around 1852 is the honest answer, and the honest answer is the one you get on this channel. What we know for certain is what came after. She had a daughter, Emma, in 1866, and through the decades that followed she cooked. She cooked for the community in Lexington, catering, feeding people at events, building the kind of local reputation that is entirely word of mouth and entirely real. By the late 1880s she was cooking for a man named Colonel John Mason Brown, a former Union officer who was also a scholar and a lawyer, in a house where good food was noticed, and then in 1889 the White House sent for her. There are 2 stories about how that happened, and the sources disagree, and I am delighted about that because both of them are lovely and we get to keep both. The Kentucky newspapers said it was the First Lady. They said Caroline Harrison wrote to a woman in Lexington named Skillman, a distant relation of hers through the Scott family, and asked her to pick out a local cook. A letter from Washington to Kentucky, asking a friend to find somebody good. The Washington newspapers said something else entirely. They said Theodore Roosevelt did it. Roosevelt at this point was a young civil service commissioner, not yet anything else, and he had been in Kentucky, and he had dined at Colonel Brown's house, and he had eaten Dolly Johnson's cooking. And unlike almost everybody else in tonight's story, Roosevelt left us his actual words about it. I'm ready to testify to the fact that it was one of the best dinners I ever ate. Dolly did herself credit, and the White House could not be better served, I am sure, than it will be by Dolly. That is a real quotation, printed in the Washington Post at the turn of 1889 into 1890, and I want to point out something about it that is easy to skate past. He's not saying she's good for a cook in Kentucky, he's saying the White House could not be better served. That is a young man with a very high opinion of himself putting his name behind a black woman in Lexington in 1889 in print. She arrived in Washington in early December of 1889. She was replacing a French chef. Madame Madeleine Pelluard had been dismissed that August, and the reason for the change was, of all things, taste. The Harrisons did not want French food. The newspapers of the time put it more bluntly than I would. They wrote that the fanciful French cooking was not at all to the plain American taste of the family. What the Harrisons wanted was what Dolly Johnson cooked, which was Kentucky bluegrass food, savoury meats, fried dishes, bread, properly made, of the kind that a household eats every day rather than admires once. The journalist Frank Carpenter wrote about it at the time, and his line is the fairest one anybody managed. The president likes the plain dishes of Dolly Johnson, the coloured cook he engaged from Kentucky, better than the complicated French menus of her predecessor. In her way, Dolly Johnson too is an artist. In her way too is an artist. That is 1890, and it is a small thing, and it is not nothing. Now here is the part of this chapter I have been looking forward to. Her arrival was an event, not a household event, a public one in Black Washington, reported in the newspapers. One report said there was a great deal of joy among the coloured people of Washington over the announcement that a Negro cook had been selected for the White House. Another said that all the coloured employees at the White House are tickled almost to death at the advent of Dolly, who was already a great favourite with them. Those are the words of the period, quoted as they were printed with the sources named, which is how this channel handles them. But listen to what is inside them. Tickled almost to death, already a great favourite. This is a working household, mostly black, mostly southern, most of whom had come into this house through a hotel or a private residence or through a family connection, a brother or a sister or a parent or an aunt already working here. And one of their own has just been given the best job in the building, the kitchen. The room Ike Hoover said the whole house was in awe of. They were pleased, of course they were pleased, and one of them said so out loud to a reporter on the record. Jerry Smith, the duster, the man in the white linen suit we met upstairs an hour ago, told a newspaperman that bringing a coloured woman from the South into the White House to preside over its kitchen would be one of the greatest acts of the administration, and would add years to the lives of the members of the executive family. Add years to their lives. That is a joke, and it is a compliment, and it is a piece of pride, all in one sentence, from a man who had been feeding and serving presidents since Grant. Her wage was $75 a month, and here is the detail that changes the shape of everything, and that almost nobody knows about the 19th century White House. That $75 did not come from the Treasury. It came out of Benjamin Harrison's own pocket. In this era, presidents paid the household staff themselves, the cooks, the maids, the valets, the personal servants of the family. The president was, in the plainest possible sense, a private employer running a private household, and his salary had to cover it. The government paid for other things and other people, and we will untangle exactly which later tonight, because the two payrolls running through one corridor is one of the strangest true facts about this building. For now, hold the simple version. The most famous kitchen in America was staffed at the personal expense of the man upstairs. One more thing about her arrival, and then we will let her cook. She came alone, into a city she did not know, to work in a house she had never seen, at the age of about 37, having been born the property of another person. Her daughter Emma was in Kentucky. Her community was in Kentucky. Everything she'd built for herself over 20 years of catering and cooking in Lexington was several hundred miles behind her. And she walked into a basement kitchen where every other person in the room already knew each other, most of them related to somebody else in the building, and took charge of it. I would like a full account of her first week. Nobody wrote one. She is at the range now. It is the winter of 1889 going into 1890, and her first great test is only a few weeks away, and it is Christmas. We will get to that dinner. It is worth the wait. But she did not do any of this alone, and the other half of this room has been working quietly at the far end of it this whole time, and almost nothing survives of her at all. One more light goes out on the floor above. Stay down here with me. We're only moving 12 feet. At the other end of the kitchen, away from the roasting heat, there is a second working surface and a second person. Her name was Mary Robinson. She was young, she was black, she came from Virginia. And she had the entire pastry side of the White House kitchen. That is very nearly everything we know about her. I'm going to say that plainly at the start rather than at the end, because I do not want to build you a person out of guesswork and then admit it afterward. A newspaper described the division of the room, and that description is the reason we have her name at all. Dolly Johnson managed the basting and the roasting of the meats and the making of the entrees. Mary Robinson oversaw the making and the baking of the pastry, crullers, pies, breads, and after that the record closes over her almost completely. So let us spend this chapter with the work instead, because the work we do know, and the work is where she actually lived. Pastry is a different trade from cooking. It is not a junior version of it. In a great kitchen of this period, the two are separated deliberately, and often physically, because they want opposite conditions. Roasting wants heat and speed and constant attention, and a cook who can hold 6 timings in her head at once. Pastry wants cool hands, cool surfaces, patience, and a kind of stillness, which means, in a basement kitchen with 2 ranges going, the pastry end of the room is the coolest corner available and everybody knows not to crowd it. Her day starts before the dinner service and runs past it. Bread has to be started long before it is wanted. Dough proves on its own schedule and there is no arguing with it. Pastry has to be made, rested, rolled, rested again, and it will punish you for hurrying it in a way that a joint of beef never will. So there is a rhythm at that end of the room that runs at a completely different tempo from the rest. The other end is loud and fast and getting louder as 7 o'clock comes on. Her end is slow and flowery and quiet and has been going since the morning. Crullers, since the word has fallen out of most American kitchens. A cruller is a twisted length of sweet dough, fried, sugared, eaten warm. It is a doughnut's older cousin, and it is exactly the kind of thing a household eats at the end of an evening rather than at a state dinner. Somebody in this house liked them enough that a newspaper thought it worth mentioning. Pies, which need no explaining, then or now. And breads, which are the real work. Bread in a house like this is not one loaf. It is a daily quantity, in several forms for a family, for the staff table, and for whatever is happening upstairs. It has to be right every single day, and nobody notices it unless it is wrong, which is the definition of the best kind of work and the reason so little of it survives in any archive. Here is what I keep thinking about, the smell of a bakery, in a basement, at night. Because that is what this corner of the White House was in the small hours and again before dawn. Warm flour, yeast, butter going into a hot oven. That smell moves further through a building than any other smell does, and it goes up. It would have been in the service stair. It would have reached the ground floor corridor where a third of this household was asleep. There are worse things to fall asleep above. And the timing of pastry is what puts her at the strange end of the clock. Bread wanted for breakfast has to be thought about the night before. Dough set to prove slowly overnight in a cool corner is doing its work while the whole house sleeps, unattended, on its own schedule, and it will be ready when it is ready rather than when anybody would prefer, which means the pastry end of this kitchen is the part of the household most closely tied to the actual hours of the night. The roasting side finishes when dinner finishes. The pastry side has a foot in tomorrow. There is something I find quietly lovely in that. While the state floor is being darkened room by room above her, and the corridor is going quiet and the furnace is being banked, there is a covered bowl in a cool corner of a basement in the White House, slowly rising in the dark, entirely on its own. Nobody is watching it. It does not need watching. It will be bred by morning. 2 cooks. That is the number for this chapter, and I want to hand it to you gently, because it is the honest disproportion of this house, and it is nothing like the ratios this channel usually reports. At Biltmore or on Fifth Avenue, or in a Newport cottage in the season, the numbers run into the dozens and the hundreds. Here, in the most famous house in America, the answer to who cooked for the president is 2 women, in a damp room under the floor, and they cooked for congressmen, and cabinet members, and heads of state, and a family, every day. That is not a smaller story than Biltmore. In some ways it is a much bigger one. Now, about the record, and about Mary Robinson. There is a photograph. Francis Benjamin Johnston went into the White House kitchen at some point between about 1891 and 1893 and took a picture of a woman standing in it. For a long time that woman was identified as Dolly Johnson. She may be. She may equally be Mary Robinson. She may be another member of the kitchen staff whose name never reached us at all. The people who study this now keep the uncertainty rather than resolving it, and I think they are right, and I think the uncertainty is actually the point. There is a photograph of a woman who cooked in the White House in the 1890s, and we cannot say for sure which one she is, and both of the candidates deserve to be known. So tonight she can be either. She's standing in a working kitchen in a plain dress with her hands at rest, and whichever of them she is the reason the president ate. We're going to go back upstairs shortly, but not far, and not for long, because there was one more person in the chain between this room and that table, and his name ended up on the cover of a book that stayed in American kitchens for 100 years. Another light goes out at the top of the service stair. Between the kitchen and the president there was a post, and the post was older than anybody holding it. The steward. Congress created the position, and Congress had a very specific reason for creating it, which tells you a great deal about how the early republic thought about its own house. The steward existed to safeguard the silver and the furnishings. That is it. That is the founding purpose. The nation had bought plate and furniture for the president's house with public money. Presidents were going to come and go every 4 years, and somebody had to be answerable for the fact that all of it was still there afterward. So the steward was a federal employee, and he was bonded, which means a surety was posted against his honesty. He was on the government payroll, unlike the cook, and over time the post grew from a guardianship into a management, until by the 19th century he was, in practice, the manager of the house. The job wanted 4 things, and the list of them is one of the better job descriptions ever written down. Patience, administrative ability, shrewdness as a purchasing agent, and a deep sense of discretion. Take those one at a time, because each one is a whole working life. Patience, because he dealt directly with every employee in the house. There was no layer between him and them. There was no specific hierarchy below him at all, which sounds informal and is actually much harder, because it means every single question in the building comes to one man. Administrative ability, because the house ran on accounts. Everything bought had to be recorded, everything used had to be accounted for, and the inventory of a public building is a permanent obligation rather than an annual one. Shrewdness as a purchasing agent, because the buying for this household came through him. In a city with markets and suppliers who all knew exactly whose house he was buying for, which is not a position of strength when you are haggling, and discretion, which is the one that mattered most and which appears in no ledger anywhere. He was inside a family's private life every day. He knew what they ate, what they spent, who came to dinner, who did not, and what the state of things was upstairs. and the entire value of him depended on none of that ever leaving the building. That last one was harder here than it would have been anywhere else in America, and I want to explain why. The newspapers wanted this house. Badly. The domestic life of the president was one of the great subjects of the American press in this decade, and they printed everything they could get. What was served, who cooked it, what the kitchen was like, what the First Lady thought of the wallpaper. We know most of tonight's story only because reporters kept asking and somebody kept answering. So the steward is standing in the middle of the most gossiped about household in the country, holding all of it, in a city where a great many people would very much like to buy him a drink. And he goes home and he says nothing, for years, through more than one administration. That is a kind of daily discipline that does not look like anything from the outside and is genuinely rare. Two stewards come to us by name from this decade. William Sinclair was steward in 1893, and he is the man who went and courted Dolly Johnson back to this house when Grover Cleveland returned for his second term. Think about that as an errand. Your president is coming back to the building after 4 years out of it. He wants his house to be right, and the man he trusts with the getting of the cook is the steward, and then there is Hugo Zeeman. Zeeman was a steward of the White House in the Cleveland era, and his name went somewhere that no other name in tonight's story went. It went onto a book. In 1887, a volume was published under two names, Mrs. F. L. Gillette and Hugo Zeeman, steward of the White House. It was called the White House Cookbook. And it sold, and it sold, and it kept selling, edition after edition, for generations. It went into American kitchens in towns that had never seen Washington, and it sat on shelves, and it got splashed, and it got handed down. Here is the part I find genuinely moving. For an enormous number of American households, over about a century, the phrase the White House first entered the kitchen not as politics and not as ceremony, but as a cookbook. A woman in Ohio or Kansas or Vermont planning a dinner reached up and took down a book that told her how the president's house did it, written by the man who ran the president's house. You can still buy it. It is still in print. That is a real object sitting in real houses tonight, connected by an unbroken line to the man walking between the kitchen and the dining room, in this building in the 1890s. And a book like that gets used rather than read, which is a different and better kind of survival. A cookbook that has been in a family for 3 generations is not a clean object. It is splashed. The spine has gone at the page somebody used most. There is handwriting in the margins from a woman who disagreed with a quantity. There is a pressed thing between 2 pages that nobody can now explain. That is what happened to the White House cookbook in tens of thousands of American kitchens for about a century. So the steward of this house, whose entire professional obligation was discretion, whose job was to be invisible, ended up as the most physically present member of tonight's household in ordinary American life, not in a museum, on a shelf at eye level, next to the flower. I think he would have found that funny. I hope somebody told him it was selling. 1887. That is your number here, and it is a publication date, which is not the kind of number this channel usually leans on. But it is the right one, because it is the year the inside of this house went out into the country and stayed there. The steward's evening, meanwhile, is entirely practical. He has seen the dinner. He has checked what is going up. He knows how many are sitting down and at what hour. He has the plate out, or he has the plate away, and either way he knows exactly where it is, because Congress made that his responsibility long ago, and nobody has ever taken it off him. Above him, the dining room is lit and laid and waiting. Below him, the Rangers are at their peak, and between the two, on the stair, the butler and the footman are about to start moving. It is nearly 7. Another light goes out in the corridor behind us as we go up. The Harrisons ate at fixed hours, and we know what they were. Breakfast at 8 in the morning, lunch at 1, dinner at 7, every day. That is your anchor for this chapter, and I want to hold it up for a second before we walk into the room, because it is such an ordinary thing and it is doing such extraordinary work. 8, 1, and 7, a household clock. The same 3 times, day after day, in a building where nothing else was predictable at all. Callers came when they came. Crises came when they came. The corridor upstairs filled with strangers on no schedule anybody controlled. And underneath all of that, 3 times a day, the family sat down. A regular mealtime is one of the oldest pieces of domestic engineering there is. It gives a household a spine. It tells the kitchen when to aim. It tells the children where the day divides. And in a house like this one, it does something else. It is the only part of the day that belongs entirely to the family, in a building that belongs to everybody. So, 7 o'clock. This is not a state dinner tonight. I want to be clear about that, because the state dinners are coming in the next chapter, and they are a different animal. Tonight is ordinary, and ordinary is what I want you to have first. The food comes from the small kitchen, the one under the butler's pantry. It comes up in the hands of the butler and the footman, and it comes up in courses, and it comes up at a walking pace that has been calibrated over years to arrive hot without arriving hurried. The dining room is lit. The gas is on, and, after 1891, perhaps some of Ike Hoover's electric light with it, and the 2 kinds of light sit together in the same room and do not quite match. Table linen, silver, glass, the plate that a steward is answerable for. And a family sits down in the middle of it. Benjamin Harrison at one end, Caroline Harrison at the other, and she is going to take over this narration for a while in a couple of chapters, because she is the person in this house who actually looked at the servants' floor and did something about it. And around them, a crowd. This is the thing people forget about the Harrison White House. It was full. Children, grandchildren, in-laws, relatives. It was a large extended family living in a house that was already too small before they arrived, which is exactly why Caroline Harrison spent her time here trying to make it bigger. The sound of a family dinner carries into the hall, and you cannot make out a word of it, and that is one of the best sounds in this whole video. Now, the machinery, because you are here for the machinery. Service at a table like this is a choreography. The footmen work in a fixed order around the table, and they do not deviate from it. Plates go down from one side and are taken from the other. A course is cleared completely before the next arrives. Glasses are watched rather than asked about. Nobody speaks unless spoken to, and the whole thing is designed to be invisible, which is to say designed so that a family can have a private conversation in the middle of 4 people working. That is the skill, not the carrying, the disappearing. And it runs on signals. A look. A hand moved slightly, the butler catching a footman's eye across the room. Downstairs the bells on the board. Upstairs, silence and glances. Between courses, in the pantry, there is a completely different atmosphere for about 90 seconds. Fast, low, entirely functional, plates stacking, the next course coming up the stair, somebody wiping a rim, somebody saying 2 words about the second wine, and then the door, and the face goes calm again, and out they go. I love that door. Every great household has one, and it is the same door everywhere in the world. On one side, the performance. On the other side, the work. And it swings. And the ordinary dinner has a quality the state dinner never has, which is that it repeats. A state dinner is an event. It gets planned and worried over and remembered and printed. It happens a handful of times a year. The 7 o'clock dinner happened 365 times a year. Every night. Same room, same hour, same people carrying the same dishes along the same route from the same kitchen. Which means it stopped being a performance quite quickly and became something better. It became a habit that a household shared. The footmen know what the family will not eat. The butler knows who will want the second helping and who will wave it away, and he adjusts without being told because after 2 years you simply know. The kitchen downstairs knows to hold something back because the youngest grandchild will be down late. That accumulated knowledge is invisible, and it is the actual substance of domestic service. It is not carrying, it is knowing, and it is why replacing a long-serving household is so much harder than replacing an individual. You are not losing labour. You are losing 300 small pieces of information about a family that nobody ever wrote down. Meanwhile, the room the family is sitting in is being kept warm by a furnace under the floor, tended by a man they will very likely never speak to. The palms in the corner came in from a glass house out past the west terrace, carried by a gardener, and they will go back out there when the season for them here is over. The house is holding this dinner up from underneath, in every possible sense. By the end of it, the light in the hall has settled to its evening level. The family will go up or into one of the drawing rooms, and under Harrison, and later under McKinley, there might be dancing in this house, which is a detail I enjoy enormously and which people do not expect. Social dancing was especially enjoyed in these years. Somebody plays. The carpet is not rolled back, because in this decade the carpet is not the sort you roll back and they dance on it anyway. Then the room empties, and the clearing begins, which is a second dinner service run backward and which nobody has ever written a memoir about. That is the ordinary night. 3 times a day at 8 and 1 and 7 for 4 years. But some nights this house did something else entirely, and when it did, the newspapers of America printed the menu. One more light goes out over the empty table. A few weeks after Dolly Johnson arrived in Washington, it was Christmas. That is the situation she walked into. New city, new kitchen, in a basement she had never worked in, with a range whose character she did not yet know. New employers, a new household, a new staff, and every eye in the building on her because she had replaced a French chef and the newspapers had already made a small national story out of it. And her first great meal in the White House was Christmas dinner, 1889. She cooked it. And then something happened that I do not think she can have expected. The newspapers printed the menu, across America, not in one paper, in papers all over the country, presented to readers as, and I am quoting the framing they used, written out for you by the president's cooks. Here is what was on it. Blue Point oysters, to begin. Turkey, of course, and Maryland terrapin, which needs a word of explanation now and needed none at all then. Terrapin was a delicacy. It was a small turtle, and in this period it was one of the most fashionable things a great American table could offer, and it was what you served when you were serving the best. It has vanished so completely from American tables that most people alive have never seen it on a menu. And then the holiday things, which have not changed at all. Mince pie, plum pudding. Read that menu again and notice what it is. It is oysters and turkey and pie. It is a good, generous, recognizable American Christmas dinner, cooked properly, at a scale. It is not a French menu of 14 courses with a printed card. That was exactly the point, and it was exactly why she was there. A few weeks later, in February of 1890, there was a cabinet dinner, and the Boston Weekly Globe printed that menu too. This was a thing the country did. The president's dinner was public property, and the public consumed it in print the way we consume photographs now. A woman in Illinois read what the president had for Christmas and knew, from the reading of it, that things at the White House were in good hands. Now let us have the other kind of night, because the state dinner was a different machine. On a state night the other kitchen wakes, the big one under the state dining room, and the house fills, and the Marine Band plays. Here is how they did it, and it is one of my favourite pieces of stagecraft in this entire era. The band was divided into 2 sections, one on each side of the lobby. One division played a number. The moment it finished, before the sound of it had cleared the room, the other division began, then back again, which means the music never stopped. Not once, not between pieces, not for the whole of a reception. There was no gap for applause, no gap for a conductor to turn a page, no gap at all. A continuous river of music running under a room full of people for hours, and they looked magnificent doing it. Bright red coats trimmed with gold braid and blue trousers, split into 2 halves across a marble lobby. I want you to hear that arrangement, because it is a deeply sleepy thought. Music with no seams in it. Two halves of a band handing the sound back and forth so that a room never once fell silent. And it solves a genuinely awkward social problem, which is the reason somebody thought of it. A silence in a crowded room is a terrible thing. Everybody hears their own conversation suddenly and lowers their voice and looks around. A room that has fallen quiet has to be started again, so the band never lets it. There is always sound, and the sound has no edges, and so nobody in that lobby is ever conscious of the music beginning or ending. It simply is the way weather is. That is very hard to do, and it takes two halves of a band and a great deal of rehearsal, and the entire purpose of all that work is that nobody notices any of it, which is by now a familiar shape. It is the same principle as the dusting, and the fires, and the palms carried in and out, and the food arriving from a room nobody has seen. The whole evening is built out of effort designed to be undetectable. When Grover Cleveland came back for his second term in 1893, the steward went and got Dolly Johnson again, and she cooked a different register of food for the Clevelands: gumbo, terrapin again, canvasback duck, and baked a possum, which was on the president's table in the 1890s and which almost nobody now would believe. And the wage changed. Under the Harrisons, she was paid $75 a month out of the president's own pocket. Under Cleveland, she was paid $150 a month. Double. $150 a month is $1,800 a year, and I want to give you that annual figure slowly because of what it sits alongside. $1,800 a year was what the chief doorkeeper was paid. It was what the steward was paid. It was what the mail clerks in Cleveland's White House were paid. The cook was paid the same as the men who ran the house. A woman born into slavery in Georgetown, Kentucky, around 1852, who had cooked for a community in Lexington until a letter or a recommendation reached her, was earning in the White House exactly what the steward earned, exactly what the clerks earned, exactly what the chief doorkeeper earned. I am not going to make a speech about that. This channel does not make speeches. I am just going to put the number in your hands and let it sit there, the way you would hold something warm. $1,800 a year in 1893 in that kitchen, and she got there by cooking. That is the whole mechanism, and there is nothing else in it. No patronage, in the ordinary sense. No family already inside the building to speak for her, which is how most of this household got in. A recommendation from somebody who had eaten her food, and then a Christmas dinner, and then a national press that decided it approved. That is about as close to a pure meritocracy as the 1890s ever managed. And it happened in a basement, and it happened to a woman who had been born owned. She stayed only a matter of months that second time and went home to Kentucky, and we will follow her all the way home before the night is out. For now the dinner is over, and the great room upstairs is empty again, and the clearing is done, and the two kitchens are winding down toward their banked fires. And the room she cooked in had been rebuilt around her, in the summer between her two visits, by a first lady who had looked at this basement and decided it would not do. Another light goes out at the top of the service stair. Come back down with me. We are going to sit in the worst rooms in the house, and I promise you they are the warmest chapter of the night. On the 9th of October, 1889, the First Lady of the United States wrote a line in her diary that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I found it. The rats have nearly taken the building. That is Caroline Harrison, 7 months into her husband's presidency, sitting down at the end of a day in the most famous house in America and writing that sentence in her own hand. I want to tell you why I love it, because the first response to a line like that is usually a wince, and a wince is entirely the wrong response. Read it again and listen to the tone. The rats have nearly taken the building. That is not horror. That is not despair. That is the exact voice of a competent woman at the end of her patience being funny about it in private. Nearly taken the building. She's giving them a military campaign. She's on the losing side of a war with rodents in the president's house, and she has decided to find that ridiculous rather than unbearable. That is a person I would like to have known. And notice where she wrote it. In a diary. Privately. At the end of a day. She did not say it to a reporter. She did not put it in a letter to a friend who might repeat it. The First Lady of the United States had a problem with the condition of the President's house, and she took it to a page nobody else was going to read, and she was funny about it there, and then presumably she closed the book and went to bed. There is a whole personality in that, a woman who does her complaining in private and her work in public. We only have the line at all because the diary survived, which is another of tonight's small accidental rescues, and she was, by every account, extremely capable. She found the White House inadequate as a residence and said so. She was not being precious. She was right. So let us look honestly at what she was living in, and then let us watch what she did about it. Because the doing is the good part. The ground floor was damp. That is the first and most persistent problem, and it is a problem of the site as much as the building. Washington is built low and wet. A basement in that city, in a house of that age, in a summer of that humidity, is going to be damp no matter who is president. It was dimly lit. There were few windows worth the name down there, so the light came from fittings on the wall all day, in rooms where people worked all day, and it had pests, damp and warm and full of food, which is the exact specification of a place that things want to live in. The basement where a third of this household slept was damp and mouldy and famous for its rats. Now, here is where I want to be careful with you, because this is the point in the night where a different kind of channel would lean in and make you uncomfortable, and I am not going to do that. Those rooms were not a horror. They were an old damp basement in a hot city in a house that had not been properly modernized since it was built, and the people who lived in them lived ordinary lives in them, with beds and belongings and companionship, exactly as people have always lived in imperfect rooms. It was not good enough. Caroline Harrison thought so, and said so. It was also home, to a group of people who mostly stayed for decades, which is not what people do when a place is unbearable. Both of those things are true at once, and the whole register of this channel lives in that both. There is a story about the rats that I have to hand you with a label on it. It is very widely repeated that Mrs. Harrison fought them with ferrets, that she had ferrets released into the house to clear them out. I have not been able to stand that up from a firm source, so I am giving it to you as it is told, which is that she is said to have set ferrets loose in the White House, and whether it happened or not, I would like you to picture it for about 10 seconds anyway, because it is a wonderful image, and this house could use the laugh. The state floor of the executive mansion at night, with the lamps down. And somewhere below it, in a corridor of old brick, a small determined animal being carried in a basket by somebody who has been given the strangest instruction of their working life. What she certainly did do was harder and better, and much less funny. She took the house in hand. Electric lighting, which is the arrival we have already sat through, came in under her. And in the summer of 1892, the kitchens. She also tried to do something enormous, and failed, and the failure is worth 30 seconds. In 1890, an engineer and friend of hers named Frederick Owen drew up plans from her ideas for a vastly expanded White House, an open court, a glass conservatory on the south front, a house scaled to the country it belonged to. It was never built. The plans exist. The house stayed the size it was. There is a version of Caroline Harrison that gets told as a woman who wanted a grander house, and I do not think it holds up. Look at what she actually spent her energy on once the big plan died. Kitchens, floors, storage, light. Every single one of those is a working improvement. Not one of them is decorative. Not one of them would show in a photograph of the East Room. A woman who wanted a palace would have started with the state floor, because the state floor is what the newspapers print. She started underneath it. She did not get the palace. She got the plumbing. And I would argue, standing here in a damp corridor at 9 o'clock at night in 1892, that the plumbing was worth more to the people in this building than the palace would ever have been. Because here is the thing about the improvements a First Lady makes to the working floor of a house. Nobody photographs them, no visitor sees them, no newspaper prints them next to a menu. They are entirely invisible from upstairs. The only people whose lives change are the people who work down here. She did it anyway. So on this particular night, In the winter after that summer, the corridor we are standing in is a slightly better corridor than it was 3 years ago, and the room at the end of it is transformed. Another light goes out along the basement corridor as somebody moves toward the far end. Come and see what she did to the kitchen. It is white, and it is bright, and after everything we have just been talking about, it is going to feel like a window opening. In the summer of 1892, the White House kitchens were taken apart. Summer is when this kind of thing happened in every great house of the age, and it is one of my favourite rhythms of the 19th century. The hot months are the quiet months, and the quiet months are when a house fills with men and dust sheets and the real work of the year gets done. Here is what she put in: new floors, tiled walls, improved ranges, zinc-lined refrigerators, additional storage space, fresh paint throughout. Let me take those slowly, because every single one of them is a person's working day made better, and none of them sound like much on a list. New floors first. A kitchen floor takes an unbelievable beating. It is wet most of the day, it has heavy things dropped on it, and it is walked on constantly by people carrying things they cannot see past. An old kitchen floor in a damp basement is uneven, absorbent, and impossible to properly clean. A new one is level, and it can be scrubbed, and things do not soak into it. Tiled walls. This is the big one, and it changes everything. A plastered or a painted wall in a working kitchen absorbs grease and steam and smell and holds them. Tile does not. Tile can be wiped. Tile reflects the light from the fittings back into a room that has no daylight, so a tiled kitchen is measurably brighter than the same room the week before. That is the change I want you to see. Walk into that room in 1890 and it is dark brown and dim. Walk into it in 1893 and it is white, and the light bounces. Improved ranges. A better range is a better working life every hour of every day. It holds heat more evenly. It responds to the damper more predictably. It wastes less coal and produces less smoke into the room. A cook with a good range can plan. A cook with a bad one is negotiating all day. Zinc-lined refrigerators, and this one needs a word because refrigerator did not mean then what it means now. There was no electricity in it. A refrigerator of this period is an insulated wooden cabinet with a compartment for a block of ice, lined in metal, usually zinc, because zinc does not rust and can be scrubbed. Cold air falls off the ice and circulates, meltwater drains away. And the ice itself was cut from northern lakes and rivers in winter, packed in sawdust, and shipped south, so that a kitchen in Washington in July was being kept cold by a New England winter that had happened 6 months earlier. I find that supply chain quietly magnificent. The president's butter was kept cool by ice that had been a frozen pond in Maine, and an ice refrigerator is a thing you have a relationship with, rather than a thing you own. Ice has to be delivered. Ice has to be carried down a stair, in a block, by somebody. Ice melts continuously, which means the drain has to be clear and the drip tray has to be dealt with, and the whole cabinet has to be dried out and scrubbed regularly, or it turns sour, and ice runs out. Which means somebody in this basement is permanently aware of how much of it there is, the way you are aware of the fuel in a car, and is ordering more before it becomes a problem. That awareness is the steward's, and it never appears in a single account of this house, and it was on his mind every warm week of every summer. Additional storage. Which sounds like the dullest item on the list, and is probably the one that changed the most hours. A kitchen without enough storage is a kitchen where everything is moved twice, and fresh paint, because the room had not had any for a very long time. Paint sounds like the trivial item on that list, and in a room with no daylight it is not trivial at all. A basement kitchen is lit entirely by fittings on the wall, and the amount of usable light in it depends almost completely on what the walls do with that light. Old paint in a working kitchen goes brown. It absorbs grease and smoke, and it darkens year by year so slowly that nobody notices it happening. And then one day somebody paints a corner and everybody sees what the room used to be. Fresh white paint, plus tile, plus better ranges, in a room with no windows is not a redecoration. It is the difference between working in a dim place and working in a bright one for 10 or 12 hours a day for the rest of your working life. 1892. That is the number for this chapter, and it is a year rather than a count. And it is the year the working floor of the White House got its first modern kitchen. Now here is the thing that makes this chapter sit exactly where it does in the night. Dolly Johnson cooked in that room twice, 3 years apart, and it was 2 different rooms. The first time, in the winter of 1889 going into 1890, she was working in the old kitchen. Dark, damp, dim, in the basement everybody complained about. That is where she cooked the Christmas dinner that the newspapers printed. She did that in the bad room, and when the steward brought her back in March of 1893, she walked down that stair into white tile and glass-fronted cabinets and better ranges and light. I keep imagining her face at the bottom of that stair. That is the sort of moment this channel exists for, and it is entirely undramatic, and nobody wrote it down, and it certainly happened. A woman coming back to a job after 3 years away and finding that somebody had rebuilt her room while she was gone. Caroline Harrison did not live to see the second visit. She died in this house in October of 1892, a few months after the kitchens were finished. I'm going to leave that there, gently, and not build anything on it, because she would not have wanted a fuss, and because this is not that kind of night. She got the kitchens done. That is a good last thing to have done for a house. The room is quiet now. The evening's work is finished and the closing down has started, and closing down a kitchen is its own ritual. The ranges are banked, which means damped down rather than put out, so that in the morning there is still fire to build on rather than fire to make. The surfaces are scrubbed. Copper goes back on its hooks in its order. The floor gets its last pass with water, and in a tiled room that water dries clean, which it never did before. The lamps down here go one at a time, the way they do everywhere in this house tonight. And along the corridor, behind a row of plain doors, about a third of this household is going to bed directly underneath the staterooms of the United States. One more light goes out at the kitchen end. Come and stand in that corridor with me. I've been looking forward to this one all night. About 1/3 of the servants of this house lived in it. They lived down here in the basement rooms. Some of those rooms were dormitory, some were private, and that is very nearly all the record tells us, so let us do what we can with it, slowly, because it is enough. 1/3. Hold that. It means the other 2/3 went home, out through a door at the back into Washington to houses and families and their own suppers, and came back in the morning. That matters, because it means this was not a closed world. The White House household went out into the black neighborhoods of Washington every night and came back in, and news went both ways, which is exactly why the papers knew that everyone in the house was tickled almost to death when Dolly Johnson arrived. And it means 1/3 did not go anywhere. Their bed and their work were in the same building, and the walk from the one to the other was 30 feet of corridor. So let us go down that corridor at 10:30 at night. The floor is stone or tile, and it is cold, and every footstep is audible in a way that carpet upstairs makes impossible. The gas fittings on the wall are down to their lowest, just enough to see by. The corridor is long and low, and it runs the width of the house under the staterooms. The doors are plain. They are painted, and they are not fine, and there is no cornice above them, and no carpet in front of them. Compare that to what is 30 feet above your head, where the red room has silk on the walls and a chandelier and a wall-to-wall carpet, and the comparison is the entire architecture of the 19th century in one vertical line. Behind the doors, ordinary human rooms. Let us say her name was Hannah. She is a composite, and I am telling you that plainly, because the archive did not keep the maids of this house by name, and I am not going to hand you an invention wearing a real woman's clothes. But there was certainly somebody like her behind one of these doors, most nights, for the whole of this decade. She has a bed with a good deal of blanket on it, because a damp basement is cold in a way that dry cold never is. She has a candle or a small lamp. She has her own things, and there will not be many of them, and they will be arranged with the particular care that people give to a small number of possessions in a small room. Something on the wall, something on the sill, a tin or a box that is hers. The room smells faintly of damp brick and faintly of the kitchen, because everything down here does, and after a week you stop noticing, and after a year it smells like home. And the sounds. This is what I most want to give you. The house settles. A big old plastered building on a cool night makes noise, and it is not a sinister noise. It is the ordinary sound of materials giving up the heat of the day. A creak somewhere. A tick in a pipe. Below the floor, the furnace, working. That is the deepest sound in the building, and it is constant, and it is felt as much as heard. A low continuous presence under everything, and there is a man down there keeping it going. From the kitchen end of the corridor, if the bread is on, that smell coming along. And from directly above, occasionally the sound of the house upstairs. Feet on a floor, a door, muffled through plaster and boards into something with no words in it at all. That is what it was like to fall asleep under the White House. I would like you to notice how ordinary it is, because that is the point I keep circling tonight. We tell the story of this building as if it were made of marble and consequence, and a third of the people in it went to sleep every night the way you are going to sleep tonight, in a room that was not perfect, warm enough under the blankets, listening to a building they knew by heart. The furnace is in, the glass is holding, the house is dark and warm, and somebody is watching over it. I am going to say that a few more times tonight, at intervals, so that if you surface at any point in the next 2 hours you land somewhere and know where you are. That is all it is for. You do not need to hold on to any of this. The fires get tended either way. There is a hierarchy in these rooms, incidentally, and it is a soft one. Some rooms are private and some are dormitory, so somebody has been allocating, and allocation always follows seniority. The longest-serving people have their own doors. That is how it works in every institution that has ever existed, and it is one of the quiet rewards of staying. And people did stay. That is the thing about this household that separates it from almost every great house this channel has visited. People came here and remained for 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50, which tells you something the ledgers never will. Think about what a room like this collects over that length of time. There is a bed in one of these rooms that somebody has slept in for 15 years. There is a chair that came in from somewhere and was never taken out. There are marks on a wall at the height of somebody's shoulder, from a coat going onto a hook 4,000 times. And there is the sound of the building, which everybody down here knows completely. That is what long service does to a person's relationship with a house. After a decade, you do not hear the building at all. You hear a change in the building. A pipe that is knocking differently, a door somewhere that should not be moving, the furnace running harder than the weather calls for, which means that at 3 a.m, in a basement corridor of the White House, there are people asleep who would wake instantly at the one sound that was wrong, and who slept straight through everything else, every night for years. That is not vigilance. It is something better and much more restful. It is familiarity. Before any of them go to bed, though, there is a table, not a grand one, a plain one at the kitchen end with the day finished and the pressure off and the food that is left. And of every room in this building, on any night of this decade, that is the one I would most like to have sat in. Another light goes out along the corridor. Come and eat with them. Here is how this household was actually built, and it is not what you would expect from a British great house. And the difference is everything. At the top, the steward. We met him. Federal employee, bonded, manager of the house. And beneath him. Not a chain, not a ladder. The record is unusually clear about this, and it says something remarkable. Beneath him were the maids, the footmen, the cooks, and the labourers. The steward dealt directly with each employee, and there was no specific hierarchy. No specific hierarchy. If you have spent any time in the world of the English country house, that sentence lands like a window opening. In an English house of this period, the hierarchy is the entire social technology. Butler, housekeeper, valet, lady's maid, first footman, second footman, kitchen maid, scullery maid, hall boy, each with a place at a table and an order of entry to a room and a form of address, and the servants' hall enforcing it more strictly than the drawing-room ever enforced anything. This house did not run that way. There was a man at the top who dealt with everybody himself, and then there was everybody in a room together. And who was everybody? Most of the servants were black Americans from the South. They had come into the president's service after similar work in a hotel or in a private residence, or, and this is the detail I love most in the entire structure, through a family connection, a brother, a sister, a parent, an aunt already working here. That is how you got in. Somebody you were related to was already inside and they spoke for you. Think about what that produces over 30 or 40 years. It produces a household where a significant proportion of the people are actually related to each other, where the person passing you a dish at the table is your aunt, where the man on the door was got his job by your brother, where the new kitchen maid is somebody's niece and everybody knew she was coming before she arrived. That is not a staff. That is closer to a congregation. And it explains something about this house that the payroll never could, which is why anybody stayed. The work was hard and the hours were long and the basement was damp. Those are the facts and I am not going to soften them. But if the person at the next chair is your aunt, and the man on the door got the job through your brother, and the woman who taught you the room has known you since you were 14, then leaving is not changing employers. Leaving is leaving your people. That is how institutions hold on to workers for 35 and 42 and 50 years, and it has almost nothing to do with wages. It also means that news travelled. When a new cook was announced, everybody in this household knew within the hour, and their families in Washington knew by supper, and the newspapers knew the next day. That is exactly why we have those printed lines about the joy in the city and the delight in this kitchen. They are not a reporter's decoration. They are the sound of a real network of people, passing something along, and the tone of the house followed from it. The record says it plainly. The tone was distinctly Southern. The pace was slow. The relationships were personal, and the social life of the house was characterized by comfortable elegance. Comfortable elegance in a damp basement. That is a lovely phrase, and I do not think it was flattery. So, the table. It is at the kitchen end of the corridor. The day's service is over, the rangers are banked. The food is what there is, which in a house that has just fed a family and possibly a table of guests is a perfectly good supper. And the room is warm because it is next to the only heat in the basement, and after a 14-hour day on stone floors, warm is not a small thing. The talk is slow. That is the pace of the house, and it is the pace of the room. Nobody is performing. Nobody is being observed. There are no bells now, or very few. Whatever happened upstairs this evening gets discussed briefly, without much ceremony, because they have all seen a great many evenings, and the novelty wore off around 1875. There will be a joke about somebody. There will be news from the city brought in by the 2/3 who go home and come back. There will be a conversation about somebody's family that has been running for a decade and picks up mid-sentence. And there is a man at that table who's been sitting at it longer than almost anyone. Jerry Smith served 8 presidencies. 8. That is your number. And it is not a number of years, it is a number of administrations, which is a different and stranger measurement of a life. He arrived under Ulysses Grant in the late 1860s, and he was still here in the years of Theodore Roosevelt. Sit at that table for a moment and understand what that means socially. He is the memory. Every question about how a thing is done in this house has, at the end of it, a man who can tell you how it was done in 1872. Every new arrival is measured gently against everybody he has watched arrive before. He does not run the household. The steward runs the household. But there is a kind of authority that has nothing to do with a post, and it belongs to whoever has been there longest and been decent about it. And in this room, at this date, it belongs to Jerry. The other thing to say about this table is the one that gives the whole night its shape. Upstairs, in this same building, A family is having its evening in silk rooms under gaslight, and they will be gone in 4 years. Down here, in a warm room off a damp corridor, there are people who will still be at this table when the next family arrives, and the one after that. Both of those things are true at once. Neither one cancels the other. The people upstairs held the highest office in the country. The people down here held the house. The supper finishes the way suppers do, without anybody announcing it. Somebody stands, somebody stacks. 2 people stay talking for another 10 minutes because they always do, and they go along the corridor to the plain doors, and the lamps come down to their lowest. One more light goes out at the kitchen end. Stay with me, because I want to give you a proper chapter on the man in the white linen suit before the house goes fully quiet. He is the best loved person in this entire building, and there is a line about him at the end of it that I have been saving all night. Jeremiah Smith was born in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, around 1839 or 1840. That is Chesapeake Country, Tidewater, Maryland, east and a little south of Washington. And the date, like so many dates in this story, is approximate, because the birth of a black child in Maryland in 1839 was not the kind of event the state took careful note of. He came to the White House in the late 1860s under Ulysses Grant as a footman, and he stayed about 35 years. 35 years. That is your number, and I would like to lay it alongside the others we have collected tonight. 9 days to wire the house, 2 cooks in the kitchen, 8 presidencies at the supper table, and 35 years of one man's working life spent inside one building. Officially, he was a labourer. That is what the government paperwork said, all the way through. Labourer is the lowest and vaguest classification on a federal payroll, and it tells you nothing at all about what a person does. What he actually did over those 35 years was everything. He was a footman, which is where he began. He was a butler, he was a cook, he was a doorman, he was a valet, he was a custodian, and in the role that made him genuinely famous, he was the duster of the White House. Let me explain how a man becomes famous for dusting, because it takes some explaining. Remember that this building was open. All day, every day, people came up the drive and in at the north door. Office seekers, tourists, petitioners, congressmen, the merely curious. They walked through the state floor of this house in a steady stream year after year, and every one of them saw Jerry. He was in those rooms. He was always in those rooms, moving through the east room and the red room and the cross hall with his feather duster, at his own pace, doing his loop. And he was, by every account, a courteous and dignified man who talked to people. So a visitor would come to Washington from Indiana or Georgia or Vermont, and they would be nervous, and they would be shown into a room in the most famous house in the country, and the person who spoke to them kindly was a black man in a white linen suit and a Turkish cap with a feather duster in his hand. And they went home, and they told everybody. That is how it happened. Over 35 years, an enormous number of Americans met exactly one member of the White House household, and it was him. He became, without ever holding a post that had a name, the face of the building. The white linen suit is worth a sentence of its own. Linen in a Washington summer is the only sane fabric. White linen is also, and I do not think this is an accident, extremely striking against the dark reds and greens of those rooms. He was not dressed like a labourer. He had a look, and he kept it, and the Turkish cap on top of it was entirely his own. The cap is the detail that tells you the most, so let us sit with it. Nobody issued him a Turkish cap. There is no livery in America that includes one. A brimless embroidered cap of that kind was a fashionable domestic item of the period, the sort of thing a man wore in his own house, and it had a slightly exotic, slightly theatrical quality that everybody of that era would have recognized instantly. He chose it. He wore it at work, in the most photographed house in the country for years, and it became the thing people remembered. That is a man designing his own public appearance inside an institution that had given him the classification of labourer. And it worked. It is in every description of him that survives. 130 years later, what has come down to us is a man in a white linen suit and a Turkish cap with a feather duster, and that image is entirely of his own making. I have been thinking about what it takes to hold a courteous, welcoming manner in front of strangers, all day, every day, for 35 years, in a country that was doing to black Americans in the 1890s what it was doing. That is not servility. That is an enormous act of self-possession, performed daily, in public, by a man who had decided who he was going to be in a room. He got sick at the end, throat cancer. And in 1904, before he died, the President of the United States went to his house in Washington to see him, Theodore Roosevelt, the same man who 15 years earlier was said in the Washington papers to have recommended a cook from Kentucky to this same household. He went to Jerry Smith's home and sat with him. And when he died, the newspapers wrote about him. Not a line in a column of deaths. A real obituary for a man whose federal classification was labourer. Here is the one from the Los Angeles Times in 1904. I have been saving it since the first hour, and it is the warmest thing in the whole of tonight's research. He was not favoured by position, for he was the dustman and the shaman. But his dignity and his courtesy made him the most conspicuous and the most liked servant in the place. Read that again slowly, because whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. He was not favoured by position, meaning the job was nothing, the title was nothing, the pay was nothing much, but his dignity and his courtesy. Two things that no employer gives you and no payroll records. Two things that were entirely, unambiguously his own, made him the most conspicuous and the most liked servant in the place, the most liked. In a house where the other candidates were the steward and the chief usher and the doorkeepers and the cook the whole administration was in awe of. The most liked person in the president's house was the man with the feather duster. That is the keeper's truth of this channel, stated better in 2 sentences by an anonymous obituary writer in 1904 than I could manage in 3 hours. The furnace is in, the glass is holding, the house is dark and warm, and it is being looked after. He is asleep now, wherever he sleeps, and the corridor is dark, and the house is fully turned over into its night. There is one last piece of the daytime we have to settle before we go into the deep of it, and it is a strange one, because the man in the white linen suit and the woman at the range were paid by 2 completely different Americas. Another light goes out. This is the oddest structural fact about the White House household in the 19th century, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There were 2 payrolls. The government paid for some of these people, the president paid for the rest out of his own pocket. Let me sort them for you, and then let us stand in the corridor and look at what that actually meant. On the government side, the federal establishment of the executive mansion. The steward, who was a federal employee and was bonded. The chief doorkeeper and the 4 doorkeepers under him. The executive clerks, including Colonel Crook, who was also the dispersing agent and therefore handed out the money. The watchman, the labourers, which is the classification Jerry Smith sat in for 35 years. The engineer and the fireman who kept the furnace, and the gardeners, out under the glass. Those people were on the payroll of the United States. Their salaries were appropriated by Congress and printed in a public register, and on the other side the president's own household, the cooks, the maids, the valets, the personal servants of the family. Those people were paid by the man upstairs, personally out of a salary he had to live on, which is why Dolly Johnson's $75 a month came from Benjamin Harrison and not from the Treasury. Now put those 2 groups back in the same corridor, because that is where they were. They worked in the same building on the same nights, up the same stairs. They ate at the same table. They were, in many cases, related to each other, and half of them were employees of the United States government, and half of them were employees of a private citizen who happened to be its president. Nobody in that corridor spent a single evening thinking about this. It is only strange from the outside, although it did have one consequence that everybody in the building would have felt immediately, and it is this. The president's own household could change with the president. If a new family arrived and wanted a different cook, they hired a different cook, out of their own money, and that was entirely their business, whereas the doorkeepers and the clerks and the watchmen and the gardeners were federal posts, and federal posts do not turn over because an election did, which is precisely why the long service records in tonight's story cluster where they do. Jerry Smith, a labourer on the federal side, 35 years, Ike Hoover, an electrician on the federal side, 42, Crook, a clerk, more than 50, Pfister, a gardener, 25, and Dolly Johnson, on the private side, 7 months and then a few months more. The state gave people permanence, the president's pocket gave people a season, and the two systems sat side by side in one basement without anybody remarking on it. But it produces one genuinely important consequence, and it is the reason this chapter exists. The government kept records. Every person on the federal side of that line got their name and their salary printed in a public document, the official register of the United States, taken every couple of years. That is how we know there was a chief doorkeeper with 4 doorkeepers under him in July of 1893. That is how we know a man named William Dubois was one of those 4, and that he moved up to the chief post when his superior left in December of 1895. The president's private household did not get printed in anything, which is why we know Dolly Johnson's story almost entirely from newspapers, and why we know Mary Robinson's name from a single article about how a kitchen was divided. The state kept its own. The rest got remembered by accident, and even the state's records are not as good as you would like. The chief doorkeeper is a case in point, and I have been dodging his name all night for a reason, so let me just show you the problem. Benjamin Harrison created a proper chief doorkeeper's post in 1889 at a salary of $1,800 a year. One account gives that appointee one name. The register 4 years later gives the chief doorkeeper a different name entirely. They might be 2 men, 4 years apart, which is perfectly likely. They might be 1 man and a transcription error. Nobody has settled it. So he stays as the chief doorkeeper, and that is where the record leaves him, and I would rather tell you that than pick one and sound confident. 2 payrolls. That is the number for this chapter, and it is the smallest number of the night, and it is doing more work than any of the others. Now, about the size of this household, because I promised you honesty on this early, and here it is. I cannot give you a total. You will hear large round figures attached to this building. The honest answer from the records that survive is that both sides of that line added together came to a few dozen people. A steward, a handful of doorkeepers, some clerks, some watchmen, a fireman, labourers, gardeners, 2 cooks, maids and footmen and valets. A few dozen people for a building that was a family home, a government office, a public monument, a stable, and a complex of 8 glass houses. A few dozen people in a house that the entire country believed it could walk into, and did. That is the real disproportion of tonight, and I am not going to inflate it, because it does not need inflating. It is astonishing exactly as it is, and it is worth setting beside the other doors this channel has stood in just once, gently. At Biltmore and out at Newport in the season, and in the great houses of Fifth Avenue, the numbers run into the dozens and the hundreds. Whole floors of staff, whole hierarchies with their own hierarchies inside them. Those households existed to be enormous, because being enormous was the point of them. The White House was not competing. It could not have competed. It was a government building with a family in it and a budget set by Congress, and the president was paying part of the household himself. So the most famous address in America was, in staff terms, comfortably the smallest great house this channel has ever visited, and it did more with it than any of them. The corridor is quiet now. Both payrolls are asleep, or nearly. The dinner is long over, the state floor is dark, the offices upstairs have been dark for hours. The kitchens are banked and scrubbed and white, and the people who are still awake in this building are the ones we came for. The furnace is in, the glass is holding. Come down one more level with me all the way to the bottom where a man is sitting with the only fire in the building that is not allowed to go out. There has been a furnace under this house since 1837. Martin van Buren put it in. Central heating in the President's house in the 1830s, which was early for anywhere and remarkable for a public building. And when he put it in, he hired a man to stoke it, and that man had to live somewhere, so a room was given over to him. That room is now the China Room. I love that more than I can properly explain. One of the pretty display rooms of the modern White House, where the presidential china is kept behind glass and looked at by visitors, began its life as the quarters of the man who fed the furnace. So the post we are visiting tonight is not a new one. It is more than 50 years old by the 1890s, and keeping this building warm has been a tradition in this house since Van Buren. 1837. That is your number for this chapter. Now let us go down and sit with him. The furnace room is the lowest and hottest place in the house, and it is the opposite of everything above it in every particular. Upstairs there is silk and carpet and a wall-to-wall hush. Down here there is brick, iron, coal dust, and a noise. The noise is the best part and nobody ever describes it, so let me try. A large furnace does not roar. A roar is what you get in the first minutes after a big charge of fresh coal, and it settles quickly. What a working furnace does most of the time is breathe. There is a draught pulling air through the firebed and up the flue, and that draught has a low continuous voice, somewhere between a hum and a sigh. Under it the fire itself makes small sounds, coal settling as it burns down, a piece breaking, the tick and creak of iron expanding, and through the pipes, all the way up through the building, the sound of heat moving, ticking, knocking. That distinctive percussive note that anybody who has slept in an old building knows in their sleep and stops hearing entirely. Let us say his name was Thomas. Composite again, and I am telling you again, because the men who did this job are exactly the group the record lost. We know the post existed, we know it was on the federal payroll, we do not know what any of them were like, so he is made of the job, and the job is real. He works in a rhythm set by the fire rather than by the clock. Feed, wait, check, adjust the damper, wait, rake the ash forward, feed again. In the evening, before he settles, the big charge goes on, banked, packed to burn slowly through the hours when nobody will be down here to tend it. That is the whole art of it. Not making a fire. Making a fire that will still be a fire at 4 a.m. without anybody touching it. There is a physical vocabulary to this that has almost entirely left the world. Coal is not one thing. It comes in sizes and grades and it behaves differently. A man who has worked one furnace for years knows how his coal burns, how it clinkers, what the ash tells him, whether the draught is right by the sound alone with his back to the fire door. None of that was ever written down. It lived in hands and ears and it went with him. There is also the ash, which nobody ever mentions and which is half the job. A furnace burning through a winter produces an enormous quantity of ash, and every bit of it has to be raked out, carried up and got rid of. That is heavy, dirty, unglamorous work done in a confined space, and it happens continuously, and if you fall behind on it the fire chokes. So the picture of a fireman sitting quietly beside a warm fire is only about a third of it. The rest is shoveling and hauling and coal coming in and ash going out, in a brick room with no daylight in it at any hour of any day, and the coal itself has to get down here. Delivered, tipped, stored, and then moved by hand to the fire, barrow load after barrow load, all winter. That is the actual physical substance of a warm house in the 19th century. Not a thermostat, a man and a shovel and a very great deal of walking backward and forward in the dark, and there is no way to be clean doing it. Coal dust gets into everything. It is fine, and it is black, and it goes into the weave of clothing, and into the creases of hands, and under fingernails, and it does not entirely come out. A man who works a furnace has hands that look like a furnace man's hands, permanently, and everybody who sees him knows what he does. Which puts him at the opposite end of this household from the footmen upstairs in their spotless service, in the same building, on the same night, keeping the same family comfortable. Both of them are doing the same job. One of them does it in white gloves in a lit room, and one of them does it in coal dust in a brick cellar, and the room upstairs cannot exist without the cellar. Both things are true, and neither man would have thought there was anything to discuss about it. And the building he's heating is a difficult one. It is old. The windows are tall and single-glazed, and there are a great many of them. The rooms are high, which means the heat goes to the ceiling and stays there. There is a basement full of damp brick that will absorb warmth all night without ever seeming grateful for it. A Washington winter is not a savage cold, but it is a wet cold, and a wet cold gets into a building like this and settles in. So he's not making a room comfortable. He's holding a losing position politely all night, and it works. Here is the part I want you to actually feel. Every single person in this building is warm because of him. The family upstairs asleep in their rooms, the maids in the basement behind their plain doors under blankets, the clerks' offices empty and dark at the east end, being kept from freezing so the ink does not turn to sludge by morning. All of it is running off a fire in a brick room at the bottom of the house, tended by one man on the federal payroll whose name we do not have. He is the sensory anchor of this entire video, and he always has been. Whenever tonight has widened out into corridors and payrolls and history, this is what has been underneath it. A banked fire in the dark, being kept in. He does his last check late. The damper is set. The bed is packed and glowing rather than flaming. The iron door goes shut and the sound in the room drops to almost nothing, and then he goes up, or he goes to a bed near enough to hear it, and the fire works on alone for 6 hours in an empty room. The furnace is in, the glass is holding, the house is asleep and somebody's awake inside it. Above him, in the empty staterooms, another man is walking the whole building alone in the dark. Another light goes out. Now, I want to say something before we go up because I know exactly what a dark white house at midnight sounds like to a modern ear. It sounds like a ghost story. There are 100 of them. This building has more legends attached to it than any house in America, and most of them live in exactly this hour. We are not doing that tonight. Not because I disapprove of it, but because it is not true to the thing itself, and because you are trying to sleep. So here is the honest version, and I think it is better. A man walks around a building he knows extremely well, in the dark, and finds everything exactly where he left it, and that is the entire event, and it happens every night for years, and it is one of the most quietly reassuring jobs there has ever been. The watchmen were on the federal payroll. Their post is real. Their names are in a register that this research did not get to, which is one of the honest gaps of tonight, and I would rather leave the gap open than fill it with a guess. So let us walk with him. He starts outside, most likely, because outside is the harder half. The grounds. There is a fence and a drive and lawns, and gas lamps on the fence line, and beyond them the city. Washington in the 1890s at 1 a.m. is properly dark by our standards. Gas lamps at intervals, pools of yellow with real darkness between them. The avenue is empty. The horse traffic died off hours ago and will not start again until well before dawn, when the market carts begin. The sounds outside are weather and distance, wind in whatever trees are on the grounds. A bell from a firehouse somewhere across the city, carrying much further at night than it ever does in the day. A single horse, somewhere, going somewhere. And that particular quality of a big house, seen from its own lawn at night. Dark windows, a lot of them, and behind 2 or 3 of them a faint light that is not a room being used but a lamp left low. Then he comes in, and the inside of the round is the part I want you to have, because it is the deepest calm this house offers. He walks the state floor. The rooms are entirely dark. He is not carrying much light, and he does not need much light, because he has walked this exact route several 100 times, and his feet know the distances. That is the thing about a familiar building in the dark. You do not see it. You remember it, in your body, at walking pace. The east room, enormous and empty, and this is the interesting one acoustically. A big room with a wall-to-wall carpet and heavy curtains is a dead room. It absorbs sound, so he walks into the largest space in the house, and it is quieter inside than the hall was, which is not what you expect and is exactly what happens. The cross hall with the coloured glass screen at the west end of it, invisible now. In the dark, opalescent glass is just a shape. The red room, the blue, the green, furniture in clusters, shrouded in nothing, just sitting there in the dark being furniture. The palms from the greenhouse standing in the corners, breathing very slowly in the way that plants do at night. The state dining room, cleared and quiet, the table bare. And upstairs, along the corridor, past the offices at the east end, dark and locked, past the family's rooms at the west end, where behind the doors the President of the United States is asleep. That is a strange sentence to write, and it must have been a strange thing to do, nightly, for years, to be the only person awake and moving on a floor where the head of state is sleeping, and to find that entirely routine, because it was. He checks. Doors, shutters, windows, anything left burning that should not be. Any smell of smoke, which is the real fear in a building of this age and the actual reason he exists far more than any intruder. And then he comes back down and starts again, or waits and goes again in an hour. A few dozen people, that is the number for this chapter, and I want to place it here deliberately, in the emptiest hour because it lands best now. A few dozen people, all told, kept this entire operation running, and at this hour, most of that few dozen is asleep, so the number awake is not a few dozen. It is perhaps 3 or 4. 3 or 4 people. In the White House, awake, holding the whole thing, one at the furnace, one on the round, 1 or 2 out under the glass, which is where we're going next. And that is the entire night establishment of the most famous house in America in the 1890s. It is not a frightening thought. I find it an enormously comforting one, because everything they were guarding was still there in the morning, every morning, for years and years and years, which means the system worked, which means their nights were almost entirely uneventful. An uneventful night is a job well done. That is true of a watchman in 1893, and it is true of everyone doing the same work tonight. And there is a peculiar comfort in walking a route you have walked 1,000 times. Anybody who has done shift work in a quiet place knows this. The first weeks the building is strange and every noise is a question. Then, somewhere around the 3rd month, it stops being a building you are checking and becomes a building you are keeping company. You start to have preferences. There is a corner you like. There is a window you always stop at without deciding to. There is a point in the round where you can hear the furnace best, and you slow down there without knowing why, because warmth is nice at 2 in the morning. That is what a long-serving watchman had. Not vigilance exactly. Companionship with a house. And the house, for its part, is doing what old houses do. Cooling, settling, making its small sounds in the order it always makes them. He knows the order. If the order changed, he would notice before he had thought about it. Everything is where it should be. It always is. He goes out through a side door onto the lawn again, and the cold comes at him after the warmth of the house, and he pulls his coat. Behind him, one more light goes out as he takes it with him, and out past the west terrace, where you and I have not been yet, there is a second night going on entirely under glass with its own weather. Come out onto the west terrace with me, because what is out here does not exist anymore, and it was one of the loveliest things in Washington. Where the West Wing stands today, there was glass, not a greenhouse, a complex. It had grown outward from the west terrace since 1857, house by house, until it had become a small city of glass attached to the side of the President's home. By the end there were 8 of them, and I want to name them one at a time, slowly, because the list itself is a pleasure. 2 rose houses, a camellia house, a grapery, a fern house, a geranium house, an orchid house, and a propagating house. 8. That is your number, and it is my favourite number of the night. 8 separate buildings of glass, each held at its own temperature, each growing something different, attached to a house that could not keep the rats out of its own basement. Let us go into them in the dark, because that is what we came for. The first thing is the temperature. You step out of the house into the cold of a Washington January, and you cross a few feet of terrace, and then you go in through a door and the air changes completely. It is warm, and it is wet, and it is still. The second thing is the smell, and it is the best smell in this entire video. Wet earth, warm leaf, that green, mineral, living smell that a greenhouse has and nothing else in the world has. Under it, whatever is flowering. In the camellia house in January, camellias. In the rose houses, roses, which is not a thing that should exist in Washington in winter and did. The third thing is the sound, which is almost nothing, and that almost nothing is the point. There is no wind in here. Outside, the weather is doing whatever it is doing, and you can hear it on the glass, rain or sleet or just the pressure of a cold wind. Inside, the air does not move. Water drips somewhere off a leaf or a shelf or a pipe. The heating pipes tick, and that is all. A greenhouse at night is one of the quietest interiors there is, and it is warm, and it smells alive. The fourth thing is the light, and there is barely any, and what there is comes from outside. Glass at night with a lamp somewhere beyond it does something specific. It gathers the light along its edges and its frames. A greenhouse in the dark is a structure of faint lines with black between them, and the leaves nearest the glass have a dull shine on them, and everything behind them is invisible. Now, the grapery, since it is the one nobody expects. A grapery is a glass house built specifically for growing grapes under cover. Vines trained along wires beneath the roof, in a controlled climate, producing dessert grapes for a table. This was a serious pursuit in the great houses of the 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic, and a good grapery was a matter of some pride. There were grapes growing under glass in Washington beside the White House in the 1890s, and the orchid house. Orchids in this period were the most demanding plants a gardener could take on, and the most prestigious. They wanted warmth and humidity within tight limits, and they were expensive, and a collection took years to build and could be lost in a night. The camellia house deserves a moment too, because camellias are the reason a glass house like this earns its keep in winter. A camellia flowers in the cold months. That is its whole character. It is a glossy, dark-leafed shrub that sits looking like nothing all summer, and then, in December and January and February, opens flowers of a size and formality that look almost artificial. Which is precisely when a house like this needs flowers most. The Washington social season ran through the winter, receptions, dinners, the New Year, and out here, in a warm glass room in January, there were camellias opening in the dark, timed by a gardener, for tables that had not been laid yet. I keep thinking about the ones that opened on nights when nothing was happening. Nobody came, nobody looked. A flower opened in a warm dark room beside the White House in January, and closed again, and nobody saw it at all. The fern house is the quietest of them, and probably the most pleasant to stand in. Ferns want shade and damp and stillness, which means a fern house at night is barely different from a fern house at noon, and the air in it is the softest air in the whole complex. And the propagating house is the workshop of the entire operation. That is where cuttings are struck and seed is started, and everything that will fill the other 7 houses next year begins, in trays, in warmth, under glass, months ahead. Which brings us to the reason this chapter belongs in the deep of the night rather than in the afternoon. These 8 houses had to be held, all night, in winter, every winter. A greenhouse loses heat catastrophically fast because it is made of glass, which is exactly what you would build if you wanted to lose heat as efficiently as possible. The whole structure is a compromise between letting light in and letting warmth out, and at night, with no sun, it is all liability. So there were stoves, and there were hot water pipes, and they had to be kept going, and somebody had to know at what point on a falling night to go out and look. and the consequence of getting it wrong is not a cold room, it is a collection. Orchids that took a decade to bring on, camellias that are older than anybody working there, a grapevine that has been trained for 15 years, one bad frost, one stove allowed to go out and it is gone, so on a hard night somebody is out here. That is the image I want to leave you with, and it is the second half of tonight's warmth, exactly matching the furnace under the house. 2 fires kept in the dark by 2 men who never meet. One in a brick room at the bottom of the house holding a family and a household through a cold night, and one out here under the glass holding 8 small climates against a Washington frost, so that there will be roses in January and camellias for the table and grapes in a bowl. The furnace is in, the glass is holding. Everybody in the house is warm and nobody in it has to think about why. The man who ran these houses did it for 25 years. Another light goes out along the terrace behind us. Henry Pfister was the head gardener of the White House from 1877 to 1902. 25 years. That is your number, and it is the last of tonight's long service figures, and I want to unfold it slowly, because a number like that is easy to read and hard to actually feel. 25 years is not a long job. It is a life. He started in 1877. He left in 1902. The year the glass came down, which we will come to at the very end of the night and which I promise to handle gently. Presidents arrived and left the whole way through, and he did not. And in all that time, every winter, he held 8 glass houses alive. Think about what a quarter of a century of that actually consists of. It is not 25 years of gardening. It is 25 sequences of the same year, and the year in a glass house is an absolutely fixed thing. Propagation in its season. Potting on. The forcing of bulbs so that there are flowers when flowers are wanted. Roses brought on for a particular week. Camellias timed for the winter season, because camellias are a winter flower, and that is exactly why a camellia house existed in a city with a winter social calendar. And every one of those cycles depends on the previous one. A gardener at his own bench in 1893 is working with plants he started in 1891 and planning for a display in 1895. That is what makes a long-serving gardener different from a long-serving anybody else. The other people in this house could, in principle, have been replaced on a Monday, and the house would have run on Tuesday. Replace the man who has been holding a collection for 25 years, and you lose the collection, because the collection lives in his head. And a collection under glass is a living archive, which is a stranger thing than it sounds. Some of those plants were older than his tenure. A camellia can live for a very long time. A vine trained in a grapery gets better with age, and is worth more every year that it is not killed. So a gardener arriving at a place like this is inheriting something, and part of his job for 25 years is simply not losing it. That is a specific kind of pressure, and it is entirely silent. Nothing good happens. Nothing is ever achieved. The plants that were here when you came are still here when you leave, and that is the whole of a successful career. Unless it goes wrong once, on one cold night, and then everybody knows. I hope somebody told him he had done it well. There is no record that anybody did. There is one more thing about a 25-year post that I keep circling back to at this hour. He would have known the plants individually. That sounds sentimental, and it is simply true of anybody who tends the same living things for that long. There is a camellia that always opens late. There is a vine that has to be pruned harder than the books say. There is a corner of the fern house that stays too wet and has to be watched in a mild winter. None of that is knowledge you could hand over in a fortnight. It is not even knowledge he could have written down, because most of it he would not have been able to put into words if you asked him. So on a cold night in 1893, when he goes out to check the stoves for the last time, he is not inspecting a facility. He is looking in on a great many things he knows personally, in the dark, the way you would check a sleeping house. Now, the part of his work that touches everything else we have looked at tonight. The palms. Every reception in this house, every state dinner, every large evening in the East Room was decorated with plants. and those plants came from out here and went back out there afterward. So on the night of a reception, the traffic between the glass and the house runs in both directions. Palms carried in and placed, flowers cut and arranged. And then, later, when the guests have gone and the lamps are coming down, the whole inventory carried back out to the houses where it can be kept alive. That is a considerable amount of physical work, done late, in the cold, across a terrace, by men whose names are not written anywhere, so that a room would look green for 4 hours, and it went back out because it had to. A palm left standing in a gaslit drawing room for a week is a palm you have lost. Gas is very hard on plants. So the greenery in every photograph of a 19th century stateroom is temporary, and it went home at the end of the night and somebody carried it. I keep coming back to how invisible all of this was designed to be. A guest at a reception in 1893 walks into the East Room and it is warm and it is bright, and there are palms in the corners and roses on the tables in January, and there is music with no gaps in it from 2 halves of a band, and a supper coming up from somewhere they cannot see. Not one element of that arrived by itself. The warmth is a man at a furnace, the light is a man with a taper, and later a man with a switch. The palms are Henry Pfister and 25 winters. The roses in January are 8 houses of glass held above freezing all night. The supper is 2 women in a basement. And every one of those people is, by design, out of sight while the room is being admired. That is the whole of what this channel is about, and this house says it more clearly than any mansion we have ever visited, because this house had so few people in it to do so much. The furnace is in, the glass is holding, the house is dark and quiet, and it is not alone in there. He does his last look late, on a cold night, along the benches, a hand to a pipe here and there, because you check heat by touch. The stove in the camellia house, damped for the night. The orchid house, which will worry him the most and always does. Then out, and the door pulled behind him, and the cold takes the warmth off his face in about 4 steps. 25 winters of that. Now. There was one day in the year when everything we have been describing had to be turned inside out, and the entire country came up the drive and in at the north door. Another light goes out under the glass. Once a year, this house opened completely. The New Year's reception was held on the 1st of January every year, from 1801 to 1932, and it was exactly what it sounds like. The public came to the White House, went in, and shook the president's hand. Not a delegation, not a list, the public. By the last decades of it, the crowds ran into the thousands. There are accounts of a line of more than 6,000 people, stretching several blocks. 6,000. That is your number for this chapter, and it is the largest one of the night by a very long way. Now, the reception itself is a daytime event, and it is well documented, and it is not, particularly, what we are here for. This channel is not interested in the handshaking. We're interested in the night before and the night after, because think about it from inside this building. A household of a few dozen people, with 2 cooks in a basement, 4 doorkeepers, a steward, a handful of watchmen, some labourers and some gardeners, has to receive several thousand strangers through a front door in a single day in the middle of winter, and then put the house back. So let us take the night before. The state floor has to be cleared for volume, furniture moved out of the way of a crowd, carpets protected where they can be, anything breakable, anything small, anything on a low surface, moved, because 6,000 people are going to walk past it. And the flowers. Palms carried in across a freezing terrace in the dark, arranged, watered. Cut flowers prepared. It is very likely the largest movement of the greenhouse inventory in the whole year, and it happens overnight, in January. The doorkeepers have the hardest planning problem in the building, because their job on the day is not opening a door. It is managing a river. 6,000 people have to go in one way, past one man and out another way without stopping for hours. 4 doorkeepers and a chief planning the movement of a small town through a private house and the fires. Every fireplace on the state floor lit and kept going. The furnace pushed hard because 6,000 people is a great deal of cold air coming through an open front door for hours. And a house that is not warm on the 1st of January is a house that gets written about. Then the day happens, then the day ends. And the night after is the one I actually want to sit in with you, because the night after is a wreck. Every floor on the state level has had thousands of pairs of wet winter boots on it. It has been raining or snowing or slushing because it is Washington in January, and all of that came inside on 6,000 pairs of feet. So there is scrubbing, hours of it, on hands and knees, in the small hours, in the East Room and the Cross Hall, and every room the line passed through, so that the floors are dry and clean before morning. Furniture goes back, every piece to its own place, and somebody knows where every piece goes, because somebody always does, and the palms go back out to the glass, in the dark, across the terrace, in the cold, hours after the last guest has gone home to tell their family that they shook the president's hand. There is a detail about that day I want to give you, because it is the one that makes the scale real. 6,000 people, one at a time, past one man. Work it out at any speed you like, even at a brisk pace, with a doorkeeper moving the line and no dawdling permitted. That is hours of continuous handshaking, and it is hours of continuous management on the other side of it, because a line does not move itself. Which means the doorkeepers spent the 1st of January doing the exact opposite of what they did every other day of the year. 364 days they were the men who kept people out, politely, one at a time. On the 1st of January they were the men who kept people moving, politely, one at a time. Same skill, same courtesy, completely inverted purpose. And when the last of them had gone, and the door was shut, all 4 of them had to stand in a hall covered in melted snow and start again. Nobody wrote about that night. There is no account of it. The newspapers covered the reception and went to press. But it happened every year, for over a century, and it was done by a few dozen people, and by morning the house looked as though nothing had occurred in it at all. Which is, in the end, the whole definition of this kind of work. It is only visible when it fails. And the 1st of January is the day the whole strange arrangement of this house makes complete sense. Because think about what the reception actually was. It was the country coming to look at its own house. Not invited guests, not a list. Anybody who wanted to stand in the cold long enough, and the house let them in, and gave them warmth, and music, and a hand to shake, and then a few dozen people stayed up all night putting it right again so that it could do the same thing next year. That is the arrangement. That is the deal the building was under, open to everybody, held together by almost nobody, and quietly restored to itself in the dark by people the 6,000 never saw. They walked out through a door held by a man they would not have been able to describe an hour later, and went home to write letters about the president. I said early on that this channel does not do speeches, and I am not going to make one now. But I do want to name the thing gently, once, because we are near the end of the night and it has been building since the first chapter. There is a particular kind of care that consists of putting something back exactly as it was, not building, not creating, restoring over and over to the same state, a house cleaned, a fire kept in, a collection held through a frost, a floor made dry again. It is the least celebrated form of work there is, and almost everything anybody has ever enjoyed rests on it. And then the house empties again, and the extra fires die down. And the palms are back where they belong, and the ordinary night comes back, the same as every other ordinary night in this decade. The lamps come down, the doors are checked, the furnace is banked, and a man walks the state floor with his hand going out to one switch after another light goes out. Come and watch him do it properly, because I have been saving the whole walk for the end. So here we are, back at the thing this entire night has been built on. Ike Hoover, walking the White House in the dark, turning the lights off. He came for 9 days in May of 1891. He stayed 42 years and 10 presidential terms. 10. That is your number for this chapter, and it is a way of measuring a life that almost nobody gets to use. Let us walk the route with him, slowly, and then let it go. He starts where the light is least needed and works toward the stair, because that is how anybody sensible does it. You do not put yourself in the dark at the far end of a building. You retreat toward your exit, extinguishing as you come. The east room first, if it has been used. The chandeliers in there are the largest job in the house and always have been, in the gas years and in the electric ones. He works his way along, then out into the cross hall and the glass screen. This is the moment of the whole walk, and I want you to have it properly. The opalescent screen stands across the west end of the hall, and it does not make light, it only handles it. All evening it has been glowing because the hall behind it was lit. As the rooms go dark one by one, the colour in the glass fades in stages, not evenly, because it is fed from several directions. And then the last lamp behind it goes, and it stops being coloured at all. It becomes a dark shape with a faint edge on it, where a little light from the entrance still reaches. 20 years that screen stood there. It came down at the start of the next century, and it was broken up, and no living person has seen its colour. But it was here on this night and every night doing this, as the man with his hand out went past it. Then the drawing rooms, west to east, or east to west, in whatever order he settled on in his first month and never changed. The red room, the blue room, the green room. Each one goes the same way. He knows where the switch is without looking. The room drops out of existence behind him, and what is left is furniture he cannot see, and windows that are now the brightest thing in it, because outside there are fence lamps and a city and a sky, and inside there is nothing. Then the state dining room cleared hours ago, then the hall itself down to whatever is left burning for the night, and that is it. The state floor of the White House is dark, and it was done by one man, by hand, room by room, on foot. Now, the reason he is doing it, because Benjamin Harrison and his family would not touch the switches. They believed the electricity might kill them. They were nervous of the electric bell system for the same reason. So the man who installed it was asked to stay, and part of his actual job for years was to turn the lights on in the evening and to come back and turn them off at night. I told you earlier that there is a famous extension of this story, and I said I would give it to you honestly, and here it is once, and then we will let it be. It is very widely said that because of that fear, the lights in the White House were simply left burning all night, that the family would not switch them off, so they stayed on until somebody came in the morning. That is the popular telling. I could not verify it from a first-hand source, so I am handing it to you as a story that has come down to us, and no more than that. What is documented is enough. They would not touch the switches. He turned the lights on. He turned them off. And I want to be fair to them one last time, because it would be easy to leave the Harrisons looking silly, and they were not silly. Electricity had been in their house for 9 days. That is the whole of their experience of it. 9 days of an invisible force that came through the walls with no flame in it, and that they had been told could kill them. Their caution was the reasonable caution of people standing at the very front of something. We are not braver than they were, we are simply later. And there's one more thing in it that I like enormously. They did not have the wiring taken out. That is the part people skip. A frightened family could have said no. They could have decided the whole experiment was a mistake and gone back to gas, which was sitting there in the same rooms working perfectly as it had for decades. Instead, they kept the electric light in a house they were living in and hired a man to operate it for them, which is, when you look at it squarely, quite brave. They wanted the new thing. They were frightened of the new thing. So they found a way to have it anyway. That is not a story about foolish people. That is a story about how every single household in America was going to meet this technology over the following 30 years, told once, early, at the most visible address in the country. Here is the modern mirror, and it is the only one I'm going to offer you, and it is meant kindly. When was the last time somebody else turned off a light for you? Not a switch you flicked on your way out of a room. A light that you left on, and that somebody came along behind you and dealt with without mentioning it, because that was simply their job or their habit or their care. It has almost certainly happened. It probably happened this week. Somebody turned something off, or picked something up, or set something right in a room you had already left. That is the whole of tonight, in one small domestic action, repeated for 130 years. The state floor is dark now. The corridor upstairs has been dark for hours. The basement is asleep behind its plain doors. The furnace is banked and holding. The glass is holding out under the terrace. The watchman is somewhere on the lawn or somewhere on the stair. And Ike Hoover goes home or goes to bed, having put the president's house to bed. The furnace is in. The glass is holding. The house is warm all the way through, and everyone in it is safe. There is one thing left to do before the morning comes, and it is the gentlest part of the night. I want to sit for a while with what the record kept of all these people, and what it did not, and I want to do it without a single word of complaint. Another light goes out. The house is quiet now, and we have a little time before the kitchen starts again, so let us use it gently. I want to talk about the record, not to complain about it, just to look at it. Here is what the record kept. It kept the salary of the chief doorkeeper, $1,800 a year from 1889, and it did not reliably keep his name. That is the shape of almost everything, and once you have seen it, you see it everywhere in this story. The state was interested in the post and not in the person. It recorded what it paid because paying is a public act and Congress appropriates the money. It did not record who anybody was, because who anybody was is not a matter of public accounting. So we know there were 4 doorkeepers in July of 1893. We know one of them was called William Dubois, and that he moved up when his chief left in December of 1895, and the chief himself is 2 possible names in 2 documents and nobody has settled it. So he stays as the chief doorkeeper, which is not a name but is at least true. The watchmen are the same. The post is documented. The men are not, or not in anything I have been able to reach. They walked this house every night for years, and we cannot say a single thing about any one of them as a person. The fireman is the same. There has been a man keeping this building warm since 1837, and the room he lived in has been turned into a display of china. The labourers, the gardeners under Pfister, the maids in the basement rooms, same. Now here is the part I want to do carefully, because there is a version of this passage that turns into an indictment, and that is not what tonight is. It is not a scandal that a household of the 1890s did not keep biographies of its staff. No household anywhere kept biographies of its staff. The great English houses did not. The Newport cottages did not. Biltmore did not. Record-keeping about ordinary people is a modern habit, and it is a very recent one, and the record here is actually rather better than most. Because look at who we do have. We have Dolly Johnson, in real detail from her birth into slavery in Georgetown, Kentucky, around 1852, to her death in Lexington in 1918. We have her wages twice. We have her menus. We have the 2 competing stories of how she was hired and the words Theodore Roosevelt used about her cooking. We have Jerry Smith, over 35 years and 8 presidencies, in his white linen suit with his obituary. We have Ike Hoover, in his own words, in a book. We have William Crook, in 2 books. We have Henry Pfister with his dates. We have Mary Robinson's name, and her half of a kitchen, from a single newspaper description. That is not nothing. For a working household of the 19th century, that is a genuinely good survival, and most of it survived by accident, through newspapers, because the American press of this period was fascinated by the domestic life of the White House and printed everything it could get. The press saved these people, not the state. The gossip columns did what the payroll would not. And there is a second rescue happening now, which is worth knowing about at this hour. The people who work on this history today go looking in places the 19th century did not consider records at all. Census returns, marriage records, death records, slave schedules, cemetery plots. That is how Dolly Johnson's life has been reassembled. Not from one document, from 20 small ones, none of which was written down with any thought of her being remembered. A census taker wrote a birth year in a box, A marriage was recorded in Kentucky in 1894. A notice ran in a paper in 1918. And a historian, a century later, put them next to each other and got a woman back. That is slow, unglamorous, careful work, and it is very close in character to the work everybody in tonight's story was doing. Somebody sitting patiently with a small task, at the end of a long line of other people who did the same, so that a thing is still here in the morning. The record keeps getting better. That is a genuinely hopeful thing to hold at this hour of the night. There is one object that holds this whole question in a single frame, and I want to end this chapter on it. At some point between about 1891 and 1893, a photographer named Francis Benjamin Johnston went down into the White House kitchen and took a photograph of a woman standing in it. For a long time that photograph was labelled as Dolly Johnson. It may be her. The dates fit her first period in the house. The people who study this now point out that it may equally be Mary Robinson, and that it may be another member of the kitchen staff whose name never reached us at all. They keep the uncertainty, they do not resolve it. And I think that is exactly right, and I think it is the perfect image for this chapter. There is a photograph of a woman who cooked in the president's house in the 1890s. She is standing in a working room, in a plain dress, and she is looking at a camera that has been carried down into a basement. We do not know which of them she is, and so, tonight, she can be all of them. She can be the cook, and the pastry cook, and the maid, and every woman who worked in that room in that decade whose name did not survive the century. That photograph belongs to all of them, and it hangs in the record where 100 names should be, and it does the job as well as anything could. That is a kind of keeping too. And there is one more form of keeping in this house that costs nothing, and that we have been doing for 3 hours. You now know that Mary Robinson made the pastry. That is all. One fact. It is not a biography and it never will be. But you know her name, and you know what her hands did, and you know roughly where in a room she stood, and an hour ago you did not. Multiply that by everybody. The chief doorkeeper who has no name and stood at that door anyway. The fireman with the coal dust in his hands. The watchman who found everything where he left it, every night, for years. The maids behind the plain doors in the basement. None of them are recoverable. All of them are rememberable in the loose warm way that you can remember a person you never met and never will. That is not history exactly. It is closer to hospitality. Making a bit of room for somebody. The furnace is in, the glass is holding. The house is dark and warm and there are hands on it still. And while we have been sitting here with all this, something has changed at the far end of the corridor. The kitchen has started again. Another light goes out and one comes on. It is about 4 o'clock. Nothing has announced this. There is no clock striking in this story, and there does not need to be. It is simply the hour when, in a house like this, the day turns over, and the turning is done by one person before anybody else is awake. Let us say her name was Sarah. Composite, again, and I will keep saying so, there was certainly somebody. She's the first person up in the White House. The corridor is cold, the lamps are at their lowest. She goes along it to the kitchen, and the kitchen is still faintly warm because the ranges were banked and not put out, and banking a range is a message left for the morning by the person who closed the night. That is a lovely piece of continuity when you think about it. The last act of the evening shift is a kindness to the first act of the morning one. Pack the fire so that whoever comes down at 4 has something to build on rather than something to make. She opens the range door and there it is, not flame. A deep red bed, sunk down, breathing very slowly. She rakes it forward, adds, opens the damper, and the fire comes back up. That is the moment. That is the whole hinge of the night. Right there. And if you're still with me at this hour, that is the last thing I would like you to actually watch. A woman crouched at an iron door in a basement, in the dark, at 4 in the morning, bringing a fire back up. And everything else in the day that follows, the breakfast at 8, the doors opening, the callers coming up the drive, the clerks along the corridor, the whole enormous public machinery of the Presidency of the United States follows from that. Then the ordinary things in their order. Water on. The room begins to warm properly and the smell of it changes, from cold iron and ash to something living. The bread, if it was set overnight, is looked at. Dough that has been proving slowly in a cool room is at its best about now, which is exactly why bakers keep the hours they keep and always have, and the deliveries start, somewhere at the back of the house, in the dark, at an hour when the city is otherwise empty. The day's food arrives. Market carts, milk, whatever the steward ordered. That traffic is one of the oldest sounds of a city before dawn, and it has not changed in any century, only the vehicles have. Meanwhile, upstairs, the fires. This is the part that most needs doing before anybody wakes, and it is the reason houses like this needed somebody up at 4. The rooms have to be warm before the family is in them, so the grates are cleared of yesterday's ash and laid fresh and lit one after another quietly, in rooms where people are still asleep. Somebody kneeling at a grate in a dark bedroom with a sleeping president in the bed. That happened, in this house, on ordinary mornings, for a very long time, and it is done quietly, which is a skill in itself. Clearing a grate is not naturally a quiet activity. Ash moves, iron rings. A coal scuttle set down badly wakes a floor, so it gets done slowly, with the hands doing things they would ordinarily do with a tool, and it takes twice as long as it needs to, and nobody ever notices that it took twice as long. There is an old rhythm to a house waking that is almost entirely gone now, and it went in exactly the order I am describing. Fire first, in the cold dark, then water, then light, then the smell of coffee finding its way up a stair. By the time anybody upstairs opens their eyes, 3 of those 4 have already happened, in silence, in rooms they are lying in. That is what it meant to be looked after in a house like this, and it is worth saying plainly at least once. It did not mean grandeur. It meant that you woke up warm, and the reason you were warm had left the room an hour ago, and the state floor is opened up and aired and put right, because in 4 hours it will be full of strangers again. 8 in the morning. That's the last number of tonight. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. The Harrison hours. The same clock we started this whole household with coming back around. And here is the thing that this entire chapter exists to say. By 8 o'clock, it will look as though none of tonight ever happened. The rooms will be warm and nobody will think about the furnace. The lamps will work and nobody will think about who turned them off. The house will be clean and the floors dry, and the palms will be standing where palms go. There will be bread, there will be coffee, the doors will open, and the first caller will come up the drive. And every single element of that is the residue of a night's work by 3 or 4 people, whose names, for the most part, we do not have. That is what a night shift is. It is work that is designed to be invisible by morning. If you can tell it happened, something went wrong. And there is one small mercy in the way this particular household was arranged, which I only noticed late. The person who came down at 4 did not have to make a fire. Somebody had left her one. The person who lit the bedroom grates was working from grates that had been cleared and laid the night before, or laid there and then, but either way in a house whose furnace had been kept in all night by somebody else, so that the cold she was working in was a bearable cold rather than a punishing one. And the bread she found in the corner had been set by a woman who went to bed hours ago and would not see it baked. Everybody in this chain is handing something to the next person. Nobody in it is doing a whole thing on their own. That is what a household is, and it is why the long-serving ones worked so well. And it is the last mechanical fact I want to leave you with tonight. The windows are going grey now, not light yet. That flat pre-dawn grey that is not a colour at all. The ranges are up, the bread is in, the first fires are lit upstairs, and the last of the lamps that were left burning through the night are put out one by one, because the day is arriving and they are not needed. One more light goes out as the windows go grey. Rest here a moment with me, because the house we have spent tonight in is going to change quite soon, and I want to tell you what happened to it, and I promise you it is a gentler story than you are expecting. Here is what happened to all of this. In 1902, the White House was rebuilt. The interiors we have walked through tonight were taken out. The offices moved off the family's floor at last and into a new wing on the west side. And to make room for that wing, the glass came down. All 8 houses, the rose houses, the camellia house, the grapery, the fern house, the geranium house, the orchid house, the propagating house. The coloured glass screen was taken out and broken up. And decades later, in the Truman years, the building was gutted again, right down to the walls, and rebuilt inside for a second time. So the rooms in tonight's video cannot be visited, not by you, not by anybody. The house is there, the walls are the walls, but the inside of it, the actual rooms we have spent 3 hours in, are gone twice over. I am not going to leave you there, because that is not what this is for, and because it is not the whole truth anyway. Let me tell you what survived, because a surprising amount of it did. Start with the glass, because it is the best of them. When the conservatory came down, it was not smashed, it was carefully dismantled, and the materials were carried across the city and used to build near identical greenhouses on the National Mall, near the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The glass of the President's camellia house was taken down, carried across Washington, and put back up again somewhere else. Somebody thought it was worth doing. Somebody went to the trouble. That is not the act of a city demolishing something. That is the act of a city moving something it did not want to lose. And I want you to think about what that job actually was, because it is the last piece of unseen work in tonight's video. Taking down a glass house carefully is far harder than knocking it down. Every pane has to come out whole. Every frame has to be labelled or it will not go back together. The whole structure has to be carried across a city, in pieces, by hand and by cart, without breaking the one material in it that breaks if you look at it wrong. Somebody did that. 8 houses of it. And they did it in the same spirit as everything else we have watched tonight. Careful, patient work on something somebody else made, so that it would still be there afterward. Even the ending of this world was done by hands like the ones we have been following all night. Next, the book. The White House Cookbook, 1887, by Mrs. F. L. Gillette and Hugo Zeeman, steward of the White House. It went on printing, edition after edition, for generations. It is still in print now. You can hold it. Which means that the steward of this house, the man whose actual job was to be discreet, and to safeguard the silver, and to buy the food, is the single most widely distributed member of tonight's household. His name went into more American homes than any president's china ever did. Next, Dolly Johnson, and this is the one I have been holding back. She went home to Kentucky. She married Edward Dandridge in January of 1894, and in the early 1900s she opened dining rooms and cafes in Lexington. And one of the places she opened she named the White House Cafe. I love that with my whole heart. She took the name with her. She had cooked in that building twice, in a basement, and she went home and put the name over her own door in her own town. In 1906, when Alice Roosevelt was married at the White House, Dolly Johnson sent a pecan cake to the wedding, from Lexington. She had left that kitchen 13 years earlier. She had cooked for 2 presidents in it, and when the president's daughter got married she baked a cake and sent it. She died in Lexington on the 1st of February 1918, and newspapers across the country carried it, and she's buried in African Cemetery No. 2 under the name Dandridge. And her story is being recovered now properly by historians and by her own city, which is why we have been able to spend 2 chapters with her tonight rather than 1 sentence. I want to say one more thing about her, and then we can go back to the corridor. She was in that kitchen for about 7 months the first time, and only a few months the second. Put together, that is well under a year of a life that ran from about 1852 to 1918. And it is the part that survived. Everything else she did, the 20 years of catering in Lexington, the cafes, the marriage, the raising of Emma, all of it would have gone the way almost every 19th century life goes, which is quietly and completely. It is those few months in a damp basement in Washington that put her name in newspapers across the country, and it is the newspapers that kept her. She could not possibly have known that. Nobody ever does. She just went to work and cooked well, and went home to Kentucky and opened a cafe and named it after the place she had been. Jerry Smith died in 1904, with the president having come to his house to see him and his obituary in the Los Angeles Times. Ike Hoover stayed 42 years and wrote it all down. William Crook stayed more than 50 and wrote it down twice. Henry Pfister held his glass houses until the year they came down, which is a kind of completeness, and I hope somebody thanked him. And the word survived too, which is the quietest survival of all. Upstairs and downstairs, the executive mansion. And the plain American phrase, the White House kitchen, which entered the popular imagination in the 1890s, in the newspapers, attached to the name of a cook from Kentucky. So the rooms are gone, and almost everything else is still here. That is usually how it goes, and it is the most comforting thing this channel knows. Buildings change, interiors get swept away, and the objects, the words, the recipes, the names and the habits go on quietly for 100 years afterward in places nobody thought to look. The furnace is in, the glass is holding, the house is dark and warm and somebody is watching over it. Now come back with me, back to that corridor on that night in 1893 before any of the changing happened, because there is one light left and I would like us to be there for it. It is very late now. The offices at the east end of the second floor have been dark for hours. The clerks are long gone, the papers are locked away, and the corridor that carries a government by day is just a hallway in a house. At the other end of it, the family's rooms are still. Whatever was said in them this evening was said a long time ago. Below us, along the basement corridor, about a third of this household is asleep behind plain painted doors, in rooms that are damp and old and theirs. Some of them have their own door because they have been here longest. Some of them are sharing. All of them are under a good weight of blanket because it is a cold house at this hour and they know it. Under the floor of all of it, the furnace is banked, not flaming. Just a deep red bed of coal breathing slowly in an iron box in a brick room, and the heat of it coming up steadily through the pipes, ticking as it goes, into rooms where people are sleeping. Out past the west terrace, under a great deal of glass, the stoves are in. 8 small climates are being held against a Washington frost. In the camellia house, the flowers are open in the dark. In the orchid house, the air is warm and wet and completely still. In the grapery, the vines are asleep along their wires, and the whole west side of the house smells faintly of wet earth and warm leaf, if you are close enough to it, which almost nobody ever was. Somewhere out on the lawn, or coming back in through a side door, a watchman is finishing a round he has walked several 100 times, and finding, as always, that everything is exactly where he left it. And on the state floor, a young man is walking the rooms with his hand going out to one switch after another. The east room goes, the cross hall goes, and the colour drains out of the coloured glass as the light behind it dies, until the screen is only a shape with a faint edge. The red room goes, the blue, the green, the state dining room goes, its table bare, cleared hours ago, and then the last one. So, the question I asked you at the start, before any of this, who was awake in that house while America slept? Here is the answer, and it is smaller and better than you would have guessed. A few dozen people ran the most famous house in America, and at this hour only 3 or 4 of them were awake. A man at a furnace, a man on a round, a man under glass, and a young electrician putting out the lights because the family would not touch the switches. That is it. That is the whole night establishment of the presidency of the United States in the 1890s, and they were not passing through. That is the part that gets me every time. Jerry Smith gave this house 35 years and 8 presidencies. Ike Hoover gave it 42 years and 10 presidential terms. Henry Pfister held 8 glass houses through 25 winters. William Crook was in this building for more than 50 years, and could stand in the corridor in 1893 and remember Lincoln in it. Add those four together, and you get more than 150 years of one building, held by four people. And they overlapped. That is the loveliest part of the arithmetic. Crook was already old in the house when Hoover arrived with his coil of wire. Jerry Smith had been dusting these rooms for 20 years before either of them mattered. Pfister was out under the glass through all of it. So on an ordinary evening in 1893 in this building at this hour, there are four men in four different parts of one house, and between them they hold its entire living memory back to the Civil War. None of them planned that. They just kept turning up. Presidents came here for 4 years, sometimes 8. The people who kept this house stayed for lifetimes. They were the continuity of the place. The presidency was the temporary part. So this is not a story about servitude, and I hope it has not felt like one. It is a story about the extraordinary reliability of ordinary people, about the fact that somebody, every single night, put a whole country's most famous house to bed, kept it warm, kept it standing, and opened the doors again in the morning as though it had never needed doing at all. And somebody is doing that right now, somewhere near you, so that you can sleep tonight. Nobody in this story set out to be remembered. That is what I keep coming back to. Not one of them was building a legacy. They were doing a shift. The electrician was doing a fortnight's work for a company. The gardener was keeping a stove in. The duster was going around a room the way he had gone around it the evening before. The cook was getting a dinner up a stair on time. And 130 years later, here we are, in the middle of the night, going slowly through their evening, because it turns out that this, the ordinary keeping of an ordinary night, is the part that lasts. Stay here a moment before you go. You are in the corridor. It is dark and it is warm. The furnace is working under the floor, and you can feel it more than hear it. The frost is being held off the camellias out under the glass. The watchman is on the lawn. The bread is set for the morning and the ranges are banked, and there is a woman who will come down at 4 and bring the fire back up. Everybody in this house is safe. Everybody in this house is warm, and the light is already out. The gates are closed, the president's house is dark and warm and watched over, and the house will keep till morning. Sleep well, friend. If any part of tonight stayed with you, leave me a comment and tell me which one, and I will read it. And if these long quiet nights are good to you, a like and a subscribe helps them find the next person who needs one. Next time, we are leaving Washington altogether and going aboard a private railroad car for an overnight journey up the line to Newport.